And it's 6 o'clock. I'm going to call the meeting to order. Nice to see everyone. Thank you for joining. We are going to we have our consent agenda, the previous minutes, and that policy read on the substitute teacher policy. Any discussion about the consent agenda? There are 2 sets of minutes. Okay, so we just need a motion then to accept the consent agenda.
I'll make that motion.
Thanks, Emily. By roll, Kat,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
Rick,
Aye.
Emily,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye. Lynn, do you have any need, or does anyone have a need to reorganize the flow of the meeting tonight?
Yes, Mary, I'd like to add COVID guidance under board business at the end.
Sure. Yep, I'll circle back to that. And then Morgan, you said we're gonna at 6:15-ish tackle the transportation study, so then we can release them.
Yep, that will come under my my section of the agenda, and I will just pull him in as soon as he logs on.
Okay, great. All right, so that brings us to our central office spotlight, and tonight it's Dawn.
Hi, everyone. So Morgan is going to take and run through the slides that I have for you. We've got a lot that's been going on as far as food service goes. Just before we get into the slides, we have taken and started the P.E.G process, and that's going very well. We have determined that all of our schools are going to be able to send out the benefit to their students effective September 1st. So any student that missed any school days because of a COVID related reason for any one day within a month, they will get that benefit for each month that they missed one day. So that's nice that we've got that. They've been talking about it for a while, and the state just gave us the guidance on how to go through with that. So Doreen Clark has done an amazing job getting our spreadsheets ready for us to present, to send to the state, and Dominic's created a report so it's easier for us to pull down that information. So it's been a group effort with central office team and admin assistants, and we're hoping for a smooth transition on this one. So to go into the spotlight, I put together some slides. We did a survey. I sent it out to the different schools, and some schools definitely had more participation than other schools did. A lot of that, I think, came because of the timing of the survey and building principals being short-staffed and having a lot that was going on in their plates and whatnot at that time. So we didn't really get as many responses as I was hoping for, but we did get 300 and some odd responses. So I've kind of captured that into my presentation tonight. So Morgan, if you want to go to the next one. So we just asked what school your student attended. As you can see, each school was assigned a different color in our pie chart. Berkshire ended up with the highest response rate, and then from there it was Richford High School, and then we went to Montgomery, in Montgomery, then Sheldon Elementary, and then Richford Elementary. So as we all know, there was a lot going on with a lot of these building principals being short-staffed and whatnot. They had a lot of other things that they were dealing with. So I'd kind of hoped to get some information out of every school, and I did not get that. So it's a hit and miss because this is a funny year and we've got a lot of other stuff that has been going on. I have looked at participation rates, and From 2019 school year, our participation rate has dropped a little bit, but not a lot. That gives me red flags. And the reason why I say that is because we now have a remote learning school, which has pulled some of our students that normally would have eaten out of our school and enrolled into that school. And then it also has taken, and we've had a lot of absences due to COVID early on. And that's where my information is coming from. So we've got a lot of things that kind of play into our participation rates and whatnot. So we can go to the next one, Morgan. So here we just kind of wanted to know, do you usually eat breakfast? Do you always eat breakfast? Do you never eat breakfast? We're kind of pretty much split as to the yes and no's are pretty close, and then sometimes take up the other half of the group. This doesn't surprise me a lot because breakfast is not always a huge thing. It's usually the same certain kids that come down and have breakfast. In the high school levels, we don't seem to see as many breakfast going out, but we have started something new this year where we are sending breakfast over to Cold Hollow Career Center so that we're capturing those students that are coming down from Richford who may not always go into the building and get that breakfast. And we're also capturing the students who might just get to school, not walk into high school and just go right to Cold Hollow. So we've kind of pulled in a few more there. With this number, some of our schools feed in the classroom, and that has its pros and its cons. So you never know. It's one time it might work, they might want that breakfast, the next time they may not want that breakfast. So breakfast is usually a tricky one. So we can go ahead, Morgan. So here we are looking to see how many people actually eat lunch. As you can see, we definitely are serving way more lunches than what we were breakfast. That is not alarming to me at all. That's actually pretty normal, and every year from before, we've always served more lunches than we have breakfast, with the one exception that Sheldon Elementary usually serves more breakfasts than they do lunches, and that's because it's brought right to the classroom for every student, whereas lunch is not. And so they seem to have a very high participation rate in Sheldon for breakfast. We can go ahead. So here we just wanted to know, if you eat, does it taste good? Do you just choose not to eat? Is that why you're not eating? Is there, can you tell us why you're not eating and whatnot? And so, we're more than half that eat sometimes, which is a nice, out of the pool of students. I mean, we're talking, we got 300 plus responses out of a district that has, I think our student count is right around 1,300. And so we certainly didn't pull half of our staff, or 3/4, even not even a quarter of our student population, our customers, we like to call it in food service, which I was hoping to get closer to that halfway mark, but we didn't. So it is what it is. You can go ahead, Morgan. So here I'm just kind of wondering, why don't you eat breakfast, or why don't you eat lunch? The one thing that I hear quite a bit from students and staff, and what I see from going around into these school buildings, are there's not always a lot of time for these kids. These kids have a very, very busy schedule, and I get that and I understand that. However, some of our schools, we are looking at it and we are trying to serve, 3-4 grades of students in a 20 to 30 minute period, that by the time that last student comes through that line, there's not a lot of time left for them to eat. That's kind of alarming to me, because I feel like we're not giving our kids enough time. But then we also, we all know they've got busy schedules, and if we give them more time. Are they really going to eat, or are they going to use that time to talk and visit with their friends? You know, we're polling young students. We polled everybody from preschool right up through to first grade. I mean, up to 12th grade. And so we did our whole range of students, and you know, they say it doesn't look good. You know, sometimes it may not look appealing to them, but it may look appealing to others. Sometimes the kids just say they're just not hungry. We get a lot of kids that say they're picky eaters, and that is a huge one. As all of us that have kids know, that we can often be very picky and not like or think that what we're eating is good. This one kind of makes me a little you know, a little alarming. Don't feel comfortable eating or going through the lunch line. That one really makes me sad, because I like to think that we have inviting cafeterias and staff that work in there. And so that definitely is something that I want to look at. And, you know, why do you not feel comfortable going through the line? Do you not feel comfortable because of friends, or because you don't want to have to make choices, or, you know, do you just not think that you're going to have enough time to go through the line and eat? And then we have some, and this one kind of, I didn't really think too much of this one until I was talking to a couple people, and they said, yeah, my kids said they don't eat breakfast or lunch because they rather sit and use that time and visit with their friends. And I'm like, oh, that could be a really good reason why people don't want to eat lunch. And so we did find that there are some kids that just rather visit with their friends rather than eat. And so, you know, that's just the way it is. You can go ahead, Morgan. So now that was pretty much what our poll was. I just want to go through and show you a few of our pictures of what we've got. This is a yogurt bar that we put out. Every week we try to have a yogurt bar for breakfast at least once a week, and that seems to be a pretty good hit with a lot of the kids. You can go ahead, Morgan. We try to have a good variety of fresh fruits and vegetables daily. This is either achieved on the line, or sometimes in some schools they may have a salad bar where they can do that. And so it's all in the makes of how what the school has for a setup and whatnot. You can go ahead. So breakfast for lunch day is always a huge thing. Kids love to have breakfast for lunch. So Sheldon Elementary decided this last time that we had breakfast for lunch, why not have a yogurt bar on breakfast for lunch? So they did it, and they did a really amazing job. They ended up taking and had some apples that were going to go bad. So they roasted them with a little bit of cinnamon, and the kids absolutely love it on their yogurt. So I love the fact that they're being creative in what they're coming up with, because that's a great way to use a product that the kid isn't going to eat. But yet, if you cut it up and serve it in a different way, they will eat it. You can go ahead. So this is the Duffy Special Day, and this is always the one that has the parents always asking, what is a Duffy Special and how do you make it? Because my kid comes home and says, we want Duffy Specials. So, you know, that's really a pretty funky name for something that's as simple as basically a ham and cheese calzone. So that's a pretty big hit in a lot of the schools. You can go ahead, Morgan. Then we have our chicken fajita day that we try to do Taco Tuesday or chicken fajita day on Tuesdays, just because, you know, it sounds right. Taco Tuesday just kind of has that flow to it that the kids like. And it's not always the custodial staff's favorite meal of the day or favorite meal on our menu, but boy, the kids love it, but it makes a mess. You can go ahead. So then we have Sheldon has a salad bar that they put out every day. Sheldon is one school where we have less help in that building. And so putting the salad bar out gives them the opportunity to have the salad bar out in the cafeteria, and then they have an adult from the cafeteria that oversees the salad bar. They have always had the salad bar at that school and have had pretty good response with it. And so that was one thing that we chose to keep having at Sheldon when we brought their program in-house. And it seems to have taken over and gone really well. You can go ahead, Morgan. So then this is the famous baked potato bar day. Some of the schools like to use a diced potato, like you can see here they do in this school. Other schools, they just like to take the baked potato and give the kids a whole baked potato with all of the fixings. And that seems to be a pretty big hit. That was one of the meals that on the survey, kids have asked, can we have baked potato bar more often? And can we have chicken tenders with baked potato bar? So in the new menu, you'll see that one gets rolled out as well. You can go ahead. Then this is pizza day. Some schools are a little more creative with their pizza selections and others are not. It's a little tough in some of the schools because we do have some schools where we are serving some of the students still in the classroom. As soon as we can get every one of those schools coming back into the cafeteria, this is my hope to get all of our schools where not necessarily saying they have to do 4 different kinds of pizza a day, but a couple would be good. It's nice because then it gives your kids the opportunity to have a meat choice or a meatless choice. So you can go ahead, Morgan. So here are some of the suggestions from what the kids had that came through in the in the survey. It's tricky when you're talking with kids because sometimes they just don't understand, why do we have to follow guidelines? Why can't we have what we want when we want? You know, some of them even have said, let us live, we're only young once. And you know, it's hard, but they understand, some of them do, that we have to follow these guidelines and these rules. And so, you know, I've taken a compile of some of their comments. There definitely was a lot more comments than what I've put here, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what some of the things are they're saying. We're getting some positive, some negative, some that are just beyond our control. We are having a tough time with getting products sometimes. That plays a role with having to change menus and whatnot. And it also plays a role with what we have for options of what we can use and whatnot. This one down here, serve more sweets like cookies, cakes, and ice cream. That was a big one. But you and I all know that under our guidelines, that just doesn't, it's not an option. So that's what I have for you. If you want to go to the last slide, Morgan. So on behalf of myself and my food service staff, I'd like to say thank you to the board for your continued support throughout the years. You guys are the reason why we can have the programs the way that we do, and you helped us out and supported us in our endeavors, and hoping that we can continue it that way. So I don't have anything else.
Thank you, Dawn. It's always awesome to see how colorful our meals are. In Franklin Northeast, you do a really great job. I was thinking about your Duffy special comment. If you did want to share that recipe, you could give it to me in a future communication. We could give this is from the FNESU food service for those families that want to try it.
That's doable.
I wouldn't mind having the recipe myself.
When I tell you the recipe, it's so simple you will not believe it.
Thank you, Dawn.
Thanks, Dawn. That's excellent. Really appreciate hearing the results of the survey. And I think it's wonderful that you're kind of reaching out to your constituents, you know, the kids, and asking, you know, for the suggestions and ways to improve. And I hear you on being a little concerned. It makes me sad that some kids maybe aren't feeling comfortable coming into the cafeteria environment. So I hope maybe we can unpack that and figure out how it can feel welcoming for all. But really appreciate all you do. It's really extraordinary. We're lucky to have you at the helm. Thank you, thank you. All right, Morgan, we're a little past the 6:15 when our transportation study person was going to join, but you want to introduce them and we'll move into that. And then after they leave, finish with the rest of your financial report.
Sounds good. So on the Zoom now is Tim Amon of Decision Support Group. And for those of you who've been around for a while, we went out to bid for a transportation study probably 4 years ago. We received 2 bids, and at that time, for various reasons, including COVID, we never went forward with that study. We reissued that RFP probably 6 months ago. DSG won that bid again, and we contracted Tim and his colleagues to look at our transportation routes through a few lenses. One would be for the potential of expanding to pre-K transportation. One would be for after-school transportation. And then a third would be for increasing the equity between where our sending towns have access to go to high school within our SU. And then, of course, they also just looked at the historical routing that we have and how we have been doing on that. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim. Tim, I think you have the ability now to share your screen, and we'll go from there.
Outstanding. Great. Well, thank you very much, and appreciate you all taking the opportunity to give me the chance to present the results of our review. I will mostly be looking over there because that's the screen that I can actually still see at this advancing age. As we go through, I'm certainly happy to answer questions as we're rolling through. If you want to hold them to the end, that's fine as well. But I do want to make sure that we fully and completely address whatever questions there may be about the work that we did. I think from my perspective, again, what we want to do is just kind of review so that the board has an understanding of what our approach was to the various analyses that Morgan identified, give you a sense of what our results were, and then talk about at least from our perspective, what we think the consequences of the results are in terms of just implementation strategies that might be necessary to bring some of this to fruition to the extent that we can. I think, as Morgan mentioned, September 21, the RFP went out or was awarded. 3 primary things identified: right, routing assessment, cost assessment, and a set of options, looking at pre-K and looking at equity around the high school choice, and then just generally an assessment of thinking about overall efficiency. With our approach, and this is really just for some basic understanding of kind of how we go about this, it really does start with what is essentially creating a baseline for the existing system, so that what we have is an understandable and, in our mind at least, complete point of departure from which we can measure any of the proposed recommendations and provide some insight into what we think the implication of those recommendations may be. So those included 4 primary assessments. One was a review of the general contract with Tercel, an understanding and an assessment of the basic costs, including some performance analysis, which we do through some performance statistics that we have used at districts both across Vermont and across the country that we use for comparative indicators. And then finally, an assessment of the routes, and just thinking about 2 primary considerations from a transportation standpoint, as you are all aware, but just for baselining everybody, in essence, transportation efficiency is driven by 2 primary things. You try to fill the bus as much as possible, and you try to reuse the bus as many times as you can, given whatever geographic, demographic, topographic constraints you may have, right? So one of the things that we look at in terms of our performance assessment is how well does the overall routing structure use the available seats that are within the contract, and then secondly, how well does it provide service? And in most instances, that's measured in terms of looking at the amount of ride time that kids are on the bus, and then the overall route times that exist in the use of the assets through the routing structure. So once those things were done, what we ended up doing is taking your information from both a student stop and route perspective and bringing that into our routing software to be able to start modeling out some of the options that may exist around the assessments that we were looking at trying to achieve. And we'll show you both some of the basic inputs, right, which is just the display of schools, kids, and stops across the system, but then also the outputs that come from that. The kinds of things that we were looking at first, one of the core elements that we started with was what would it take to try to bring all students to a 60-minute ride time? And then how would we go about modeling that? And that includes things like thinking about how early we would get to schools, how late we would depart from schools in the afternoon, and then obviously the route paths that would be necessary to accomplish those things. What schools could we pair up? Those sorts of routing techniques and routing strategies that we might be able to implement. And then in addition to that, we use those same baselines to develop some other options if that 60-minute guideline proved to be something that might be infeasible either from a cost or just from an availability of resources perspective. And then the last component of it is really that assessment. Is once we had a set of routes that existed, we could use both the existing contract and some of the things that just we know about what's happening up there from some of our other work to estimate what we think the cost might be overall and any change of resources. So either costs or savings, depending on the direction that things went. In addition, one of the things that we obviously have to assess now in particular, and you folks are far more suffering through this, I think, than I am, but from the standpoint of just resource availability, resources not necessarily being buses, but that's an emerging issue, but in particular, the availability of drivers to service the existing routes. And then, so obviously we're thinking about that in terms of any kind of expansion of the system as may be required. And then thinking of in the options that might be more non-traditional routing techniques, more non-traditional services that may support the implementation of the programs. They may complicate the overall management of transportation, but in the end, they're routing efficiency techniques that can be used to reduce the amount of resources required. It just overall, one of the things that we would want to try to balance that against is the administrative and managerial burden that comes with operating some of those things. And we'll talk about them as we get into the explanation of results here in a little bit. And then lastly, just thinking about paths toward implementation for any of these, to the extent that, at least in our opinion, there is sort of a viable path. So beginning
Tim,
with
any chance you can blow that up to full screen?
Sure, yeah.
I did share it with the board in advance, but I don't know if everybody's got it in front of them.
There we go. I'm actually far more terrified that I'm going to make a mistake and the whole thing is going to disappear. But we'll see.
I got a copy, so I can bail you out.
We'll recover if I do, though. So again, just as I mentioned, just thinking about a baselining perspective. When we look at your system, from the perspective of 400 or 500 other operations from around North America and overseas, one of the things that obviously emerges right away is we've got this large geographic area that is challenged by roadway availability, that is challenged by geography, that is challenged by the distribution of kids, right? Nothing is evenly spread out, which from a routing perspective, obviously makes things a challenge. So that's clearly one of the things that we're taking into account in all of the assessments that we're doing. And I think it's important to note, and obviously this won't be new to anybody, the information that we're using is 2021 information. So that is challenged again by sort of the activities and the constraints of COVID and all of those kind of things. But I think they are reflective and appropriately illustrative of what the system might look like in general. So I think they provide a valid point of departure from making any of the assessments and any of the analyses that we completed. Right, so just so you're aware, the baseline system that we were looking at had 22 route buses, really 22 and a half, because there was one route that was kind of afternoon only. We transport about 825 kids on 1,400 miles a day, which is a fair number of miles for a smaller to medium-sized system. And if we think about the amount of time consumed every day, it's more than a 24-hour day. So if we think about just from the routing perspective, how much time are the routes on the road, it's 25 hours and 40 minutes a day. So your system, while it may not be gigantic, it is big enough to have the complexities and the complications that that make transportation a challenge for a lot of districts, but most relevantly for you all trying to maneuver the combination of balancing time and distance from a logistics standpoint that we're doing in any transportation question. And then overall in fiscal year 21, we have 1.3 million in expenditures for transportation. So it's a system obviously that consumes a significant amount of attention by virtue of its complexity and its complications, and consumes a fair bit of resources from a financial perspective. Right. So our assessment makes an effort to keep all of those things in mind. A base element from which we want to look at, and I would compliment the district on this in a very strong way. Your contract actually is one of the better among the best contracts that we've seen for smaller to medium-sized districts. It does a very good job of trying to define the transportation scope without being overly restrictive to the contractor or being underly definitive in terms of what the district is looking for. So overall, I think that's a really strong aspect of the way that you're providing services. And for whatever you do going forward, helps as a point of departure in terms of thinking about how do we want to describe the transportation problem either to the existing vendor or to a vendor community were we to go out for some kind of a solicitation. Right. So I think you're generally in pretty good space there. The only thing that we did notice, and this is an emerging issue, is the issue around insurance requirements. We are seeing some changes in base level of insurance that the insurance providers are talking to us about when we ask them about what we think should be in contracts. And two primary things are emerging. One of them is mentioned here, is ensuring that there's an explicit either rider in the general liability policy or an explicit policy for misconduct and molestation. And I mean, as uncomfortable as it might be to talk about, it is one of those things that has emerged as an issue. So we make an effort to make sure that all of the contracts that we're either reviewing or developing have some kind of identification of that in the insurance requirements to put on the contractor. The other thing that you may want to think of, and this isn't mentioned here, but it's emerging like quite literally, as I'm sure you can all imagine, like by the day, issues around cyber insurance, particularly because you're transferring student information back and forth between the contractor and yourselves. Thinking about some kind of cyber coverage if it's not covered in general liability, in order to make sure that one, that it raises the awareness that the transfer of information and all of the information covered by both HIPAA and FERPA are handled with the care and appropriateness that they're supposed to, but also that as much as transportation people at times in particular don't think that they're going to be subject to the massive amount of increase in terms of targeting that is being done to state and local entities, be they school districts or municipal governments, is logarithmically increasing every year. So just being aware of that and thinking about that as a potential component of a future contract, I think, is a worthwhile consideration as well. When we think about cost, overall, actually, when we think about cost, we think about it as within two primary metrics. One is, and they're both related to obviously the way the system is supposed to be designed, right? Which is, what does it cost us to put a bus on the road, right? How much does it cost us to get a vehicle out there to provide service? And the second one is really from a units of service measure, what does it cost us to transport a student? So the metrics that you'll see here that we're talking about is assuming this 1.3 million in expenditures and 22 and a half routes, counting our PM only route, we fall in at right around $60,000 a year for a per bus, which is very consistent. It's a little bit higher, we were seeing 55, 57,000 in some of our other work in Vermont, but your contract is a little bit newer in terms of the rate that was just recently renegotiated. So it's not surprising to us that it's a little bit higher. But it falls right in with what we would expect it to. So there's nothing in that cost that made us say, wow, this is either fantastically expensive or really under-resourced, right? It fell into where we would expect it to. The cost per student number is a little bit more volatile, and that's predominantly a problem with the denominator. If we think about it from the standpoint of the students who are transported, we're looking at roughly $1,600 a kid, $1,630 a kid, which is a little bit on the high side, but that's, and as we'll talk about going forward, that's predominantly a factor in the number of students who are using your system, not necessarily in the fact that the contract itself is really expensive, right? So if what we had was a slight uptick in ridership, we would have a statistic that is right in the ballpark of where we would expect, right? So we just have to be careful about the interpretation of the denominator on all of this to make sure that we're thinking about the performance statistics the right way. So, there was nothing in that either assessment of cost, the assessment of the contract, or the evaluation of the performance statistics that gave us a huge amount of pause to say this is wildly expensive in some way and needs to have significant amounts of efficiency from a cost standpoint driven in it. And in addition to that, one of the things that we always think about as well is just the rate structure. How do we aggregate those costs? And in doing so, do we create a set of indirect costs either from the contractor for the development of invoices every month or from the district from the evaluation of the appropriateness of the invoices? And so your rate structure as we see it, I think, is perfectly appropriate with other kinds of operations, both of your size and frankly of any size. So we don't have a huge amount of concerns about that either. So in getting into the system, a couple things to explain here. The red boxes, just to start with, just in case. So the way that our routing software works is, we plug all the students in. So this is a summary of students by school. You can see them colored by their school location, and the spheres are obviously density bubbles in terms of where kids are at. The red blocks just happen to be where a student's name may have come up, and obviously for purposes of privacy, we've just blocked the names out, right? That it doesn't mean anything more than that, other than just making sure we covered up the name. So the way that our system works is we got a copy of the student list from your folks. We bring the student list in and geocode it to the addresses on record for those kids in order to do two things, right? One is to just obviously to have some sense of what is the density of the student population look like. as it relates either to a specific school or to the district in general. And then the second one in terms of being able, from our own standpoint, when we're looking at alternatives to routing, to start to understand where might we be able to pair up kids who are going to different schools, right? The same process obviously occurs with your school locations. In that, we are looking at things like where is the school from just a geographic standpoint, the temporal questions of what time does school start and what time does school end, what time should we get into school, what time should we leave school in the afternoon from a planning standpoint, right? All of those things get dropped into the routing software in order for us to be able to do our modeling. Okay, so that's just a general student distribution, particularly for districts who don't have routing software readily available. Oftentimes this is kind of a surprise because it's the first time you see the distribution of the kids across the district in a visual way to be able to understand from a transportation standpoint what some of the routing challenges might be. So it's a useful way for us to frame the problem as we're looking at additional options. Same thing goes with bus stop locations. So one of the things that we received was a list of bus stops from your contractor. And we pulled all those stops out and did the same thing that we would do with students, which is to geocode the location of the stops and be able to use those as a point of departure. Everything that you see in the red dots, or they may look orange for you, is an actual bus stop location. Everything that is in pink is a school location. And we do have, and so our system and the way we use it treats schools and various other locations uniquely in terms of it being a location where a bus can stop, or it is a location that a bus can travel through, were we to develop some sort of system where we had a collection of students meeting at a school, for example, and then we were traveling on to some other place. Okay, so this is all the stops. One of the things, obviously, that is an important consideration is what is the distribution of stops relative to the number of kids, and we'll get to that as we get a little bit further downstream. Okay, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we care about when we think about the structure of the system is how well are we using the seats that we're purchasing through the contract, right? So in essence, how many seats are we filling on every route that we operate? And it's important to keep in mind, I'm sure all of you have seen, sort of the big yellow bus that with the pointy out nose, has by manufacturer's rated capacity, 72 seats. The assumption there is that every kid has a 13-inch butt. That is generally not a great assumption, but it is the one upon which things are manufactured by. So there you go. That's how you get to 72 seats, because the seats are 39 inches wide on the assumption that we can put 3 kids with 13-inch butts, right? So when we look at and use that number as a consideration, what we see is that we've got roughly 1,400 available seats and roughly 800 kids riding. We're missing a route in the middle, again, just that there was just no data available on, but that gives us a number that's roughly 52%, were we to assume that 3 kids per seat. One of the things that we know is because we are transporting K-12 together, we're not going to get 3 kids to a seat. So we adjust that capacity value by essentially putting 4 kids on a row. Right, so we've got a 2/3 of the available seats that we use instead. So a 72 passenger manufacturer rated bus goes down to 48 available seats. Right, so that's the way we think about it. And when we do that for your system, the metric actually goes up pretty substantially, right? Because essentially we're taking away 1/3 of capacity, recognizing what we have to do from a geographic perspective, and when we do that, overall rated capacity is at 76%, which is from a plan standpoint, is right where we would expect it to be. It's actually on the high side of it. So that's a helpful statistic to know that the number of seats being used, again, is reflective of a system that is overall operating effectively, which is, I think, why we see the cost metrics where we do, right? If the number of seats being used was really low, things would be much more expensive than we've seen them at. And when we think about service quality is often mostly defined by how long kids are on the bus and how long the routes are. What you see here is a distribution of the routes and their morning and afternoon lengths from first pickup to last drop off. So just for purposes of reference, because I know it's kind of small on the screen. Right here is the 1 hour window. In that 60-minute window, what we can see is we obviously have a significant number of routes over that 60-minute window. Right here is the 90-minute window, which is where we lick on a whole chunk of the routes, about 14 of them, and not about, actually 14 of them are actually over that. And so this isn't, frankly, unexpected in an area that is so large geographically and that doesn't have thousands and thousands of roadway possibilities to connect various nodes, right? So none of this is unexpected, but it is, and it helped for us in our familiarity, getting our familiarity with your system. It helped for us to define what some of the possibilities might be and what some of the challenges might be as we were starting to try to drive ride time down to that 60-minute threshold that we were talking about. Right. So again, overall, none of this is really surprising. None of it is I think, unreflective of a system that's being thoughtfully designed. Because when we look at the route paths that get us to those above 60-minute routes, it's not as if they're just wandering around out there. I mean, they just have a long way to go. And there's just not much you can do about it if what you're doing is also having to stop 10 or 15 times to pick up kids along the way, right? So a 45-minute ride, if we were doing it in our car by ourselves, isn't going to make it in 60 minutes if we actually have to pick up other kids. It's just not going to happen. So we've got to recognize that from the design of the routing structure. So again, sort of the overall routing assessment, we've mentioned a fair bit of this already. The only thing that we would suggest that came out of our assessment of this is there are an enormous number of stops in the system, right? We have roughly 800 riders and 1,000 stops, which means that some kids must have 2 stops that are available to them. They may be a split custody. It may be a parent-grandparent arrangement. It may be a whole bunch of things. But I think what's important is to acknowledge and to recognize that we need to look at and think about these routes and think about the stop locations. If what we can try to do is take some of them out of the system and speed the system up a little bit, right? Because every time we don't have to stop, because we don't have to make 2 stops on a 300-foot road, if it's safe to be able to do so, that helps the system, right? That helps us do a better job of using the asset. And one of the things that also happens typically, particularly in systems that have to service a lot of rural areas, is there's an awful lot of courtesy that gets created. And that courtesy evolves over time, and it generally doesn't evolve to the downside, right? It generally evolves to more accommodating, which is more likely to slow the system down than being less accommodating. So what we would suggest is taking the opportunity with whomever is your service provider to review the stop locations, to review the assignments to stops, and determine whether or not there are opportunities to either consolidate those locations and or to be able to reduce the number of times that a bus has to stop on any one of its individual routes. Okay, so transitioning to the analysis, again, what we were doing is what is effectively 3 separate but related analyses, right? The first one, as I mentioned, was thinking about 60-minute ride times. And then you'll see the other 2 that we looked at were derivative predominantly as a result of our initial assessment that we think 60 minutes is probably too aggressive for the SU to be able to handle, either from a logistics standpoint or from a cost standpoint in terms of what might need to be added. So we conducted 2 additional assessments. One is looking at the system in 90-minute lengths as a maximum. And then a third one being, what would your existing system require if we were to tweak it some to try to take those 14 routes that are above 60 minutes back down to that 60-minute value, right? So we'll review each one of those. But I think what's important to keep in mind, because we don't know exactly which 826 kids are on the routes on any given day, our assessment was done a little bit different for the first 2 scenarios than your current routing structure, right? So for the first 2 scenarios, what we did is to take your policy guidance that dictates who's eligible and who's not for service and remove those kids from eligibility. But when we do that, we still end up with over 1,400 kids who are eligible for service, right? And what we know is you have 800 kids riding, but I don't know which 800 kids. And it's not really possible for me to guess appropriately, right? So the models that we built were built on this assumption that we have 1,400 kids, which we describe as full eligibility throughout the study. Those 1,400 roughly fully eligible kids being provided services within the parameters that we mentioned, which is either a 60-minute or in the second assessment, a 90-minute ride time, in order to see what the requirements might be from a number of buses standpoint. And then only in the third assessment did we take your current system and see what we might have to do to drive that down to 60 minutes. Okay, so just as we talked through the first 2, it's really important to keep in mind that as we mentioned, there's approximately 600 more kids in our analysis than are currently riding in your system. Okay, because those kids are eligible, so they may ride at some point, they may not right now, but again, not knowing which 600 kids, that's the challenge.
Tim, do you mind if I just interject quickly? I have one quick question. The 60 minutes and the 90 minutes, this is at one way, like.
Yes, I'm sorry, that's correct. Yeah, so it would be.
Wanted to clarify that that's a one way. So that's a child that's potentially spending 2 to 2.5 hours a day on the bus.
That's correct. That is correct. Yep. So it's a
Okay.
one-way trip. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. I should have mentioned that. And again, what as we were putting this together, assuming full eligibility and assuming the 60 minutes, there are certain other parameters that we had to define in terms of looking at the routing challenge. One of the requirements and one of the things that we were looking at is whether or not we could incorporate pre-K students into the routing solution in order to be able to provide expanded services there. So those students were included into this analysis. In terms of stop assignments, we assigned students to the nearest stop to their home based on the over 1,000 stops that we had available. In the event that we didn't have a stop for them some way, somehow, we created a stop that was either at their home or proximal to their home where it could be shared amongst more than one kid. So there are some stops that we ended up having to create to be able to support that. And then lastly, what we maintained as a starting point, the existing bell schedule, but designed the routes such that they would arrive at school 10 minutes before the bell rang, obviously to allow the students to get off the bus and get to their locker and get to class or get to their homeroom. And then in the afternoon, we designed it such that the bus would depart from school 10 minutes after the bell rang in order, again, to allow for, the exodus from school at the end of the day. Okay, so those are just important parameters to keep in mind in terms of that challenge, as we mentioned, of filling the bus and reusing the bus as many times as possible. So when we look at the 60-minute ride time, this is what we refer to as the spaghetti diagram, right? Which is just the design of the routes, and it looks like they're running all over each other like a bowl of spaghetti. But it is this integrated system of 1 hour ridership with full eligibility. So just from a pure, the easiest way to describe this is it's just not feasible with the distances and the number of kids, right? So we ended at 64 buses when we thought that number was still too high to be attainable. And even there, a third of those 64 buses are over an hour. Now they're all under 90 minutes, but they're over an hour because it just didn't make sense, obviously, to have a 72-minute route with 2 kids on it. So those kids got assigned to another bus and it made the route longer, right? So what we see is just the challenge on this 64 bus scenario is we don't think it's feasible from a cost standpoint because it's an almost tripling of existing transportation costs. We also don't think that it would be necessarily viable from a vendor community standpoint, right? Getting enough vendor participation to roll 65 buses up there. And frankly, if you were really doing this, you'd probably need 70 or so because we would need spare buses for when vehicles go down for maintenance and all that kind of other stuff. So just getting the physical assets themselves would be a challenge. And then we actually need to put a butt in the seat to drive it. And that might be the biggest challenge out of all of them. Right. So finding 70 people to do this, we just believe is infeasible. Now, I mean, certainly we can disagree about that, but I think from our basic assessment and understanding of everything that's going on both across Vermont, up by where you are and across the country, that just doesn't work. But that doesn't mean the scenario didn't yield useful insights. One of the things that it did yield is in looking at this relative to your current system, the non-riders are actually benefiting your current system pretty substantially in terms of reducing the number of seats you have to purchase, or looked at another way, reducing the number of buses you need to use in your system by a pretty substantial amount, right? So one of the things that we need to be cognizant of is whatever we do from a systemic standpoint to increase ridership is certainly good from the perspective of a logistics transportation guy. But one of the things that we want to be thinking about is whether or not the system itself, being the physical assets and the people, are able to accommodate that, right? So that becomes something that we were thinking through as we were approaching all of these individual assessments. So again, keeping in mind significant shifts in demand would really disrupt the existing system. And then I think lastly, what it demonstrates is the single tier system that you have created, meaning we have kids from K to 12 all riding together and being serviced at the same time, is in essence the most feasible methodology for you because of the distances to be traveled. I mean, if we had to split this system up into a multi-tier system and we had one school start at 8, the next school at the earliest could probably start at 9:30, right? Which if we add on the length of day to that means that it may be a 4 o'clock departure, which means if we add on an hour to an hour and 15-minute ride time for that, may mean a 5:30, 6 o'clock drop off for a kid. Right. So we've got to be really understanding of why the rationale for a single tier system, and at least in our mind, from the geographic challenges and the density challenges, that single tier system continues to make a lot of sense. So in thinking about an alternative, right? This is where I mentioned, we still have those same basic 1,400 kids that we're thinking about. We have a 90-minute ride time instead of a 60-minute ride time, but everything else was kept the same. And what that really does, and this shouldn't be that surprising given the way that your system operates right now with a chunk of 90-minute rides, is that drives that 60 plus buses down to 35, which feels a lot more manageable, actually, from both a vendor community standpoint and from a cost standpoint. And it's always interesting to see how the even, 15 minutes, 30 minutes is a lot of time when it comes to transportation. So that created a lot of opportunities for us to do things a little bit differently in the way that we routed, which gave us an opportunity to essentially cut the number of buses required in half. And so, so that, allows us to have a scenario from which we can work to think about this opportunity. And when we do that, what we see is that we think it's a viable path when we think about full ridership. It allows for us to integrate PK students onto the existing routes. It means that we would have PK to 12 students riding together. It would continue to support after-school activities if we think about departure times at the end of the day and when buses could be back and available to support those kinds of activities. I do think overall, and this is a function at least of as many kids in the system, is that overall ride times on average, right, would likely increase. I think we would see, the mean shift to the right, and because we would have a whole bunch of additional kids, meaning more stops. So we would be consuming a little bit more time. But again, overall, it still provides a viable option. Well, it's a viable option from my perspective, I guess, because we would have to add, approximately 13 buses at your average cost would be about $780,000 in additional transportation expense. Thinking about the vendor community, I think the community is robust enough to be able to handle that up there. So were you to want to accommodate a 90-minute maximum ride time and full eligibility, the existing, this kind of structure could do that. One of the things, as we mentioned, is an ongoing refinement of this with whomever your selected vendor is would help yield some opportunities to reduce those ride times and create additional efficiencies that we're just not going to know by not being on the ground, right? I mean, there are certain places, I'm sure even there, where you just can't make a left-hand turn at 2:30, even if our route says go left, right? So you decide to go right and then you go left somewhere else and that shaves 10 minutes off of a route, that's helpful, right? So it's those sorts of continued refinements, I think, that would be necessary in terms of a path to implementation for this. And then if we look at your current system and assess what might be required for a 60-minute ride time overall as a ceiling, again, we still think there are enough available seats to incorporate the pre-K kids were you to decide to do that. Having the community discussion, board discussion about having PK to 12 riding the bus at the same time is something that always has to go on with these kinds of scenarios. You're in a better position than most because you have kindergarten to 12 riding together already. But I think what we would have to do, obviously, to be able to do this is there would need to be additional resources added into the system. Our guess is it's roughly half of what it would take for the other scenario, so somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8 buses to be able to accommodate this, which if you just, again, using this roughly $60,000 average, gives us somewhere between $360,000 and $480,000 to be able to do that. So, what these three scenarios, I think, in particular provide is they provide a set of goalposts within which you can start to think about the structure of the system. This one being the lowest cost, yielding some benefit on the ride time. The 60-minute scenario that we think is inviable, yielding the clearly highest cost and most difficult from a logistical standpoint, and then something in the middle when we think about 90 minutes and full eligibility, right? So it gives you a feel for, I think, what some of the opportunities are within the existing system to accommodate some of the goals that were identified in the RFP.
I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
Did you do any analysis on, so you're just talking about reducing bus routes, right? Did you do any evaluation of the number of students that say have a 90-minute bus, that were actually on the bus for that period of time?
Yeah,
So when you make your recommendation for 6 to 8 more buses, how many how many students are we actually affecting ride time for?
Yeah, so because we don't know exactly which kid is where, I can't necessarily do that. I can look at it in the macro sense from the overall route length, but I can't necessarily do it at an individual student ridership level.
Okay, so you can't go back and look at your,
Yeah,
I guess you probably have
it's
students with
possible to do.
multiple stops, right?
Right.
But a lot of those might have only, a lot of those stops only have one student or
Yeah.
two students getting on,
Exactly. So the real question is, what does the distribution of ridership look like, right? So let's take two extreme examples, right? We have two kids on a route, one kid who rides for 1 minute, one kid who rides for 89 minutes. That's 45 minutes on average, but the distribution's really broken, right? And so until we could get down to that real student level information and could see the shape of the distributions on each of the individual rides, we could start to have some understanding of what kind of trade-offs you're making. We just don't have what's necessary to do that quite yet. I mean, that's certainly a possible thing to do. It just would require a level of detail that we don't have.
Yeah, in my opinion, that's an important detail because you might even do things totally different based on that. So if you have a couple kids that are far out, you may actually even send a small bus out farther, pack that bus while you maintain your larger buses for closer routes. So to me, that's actually one of the most important things to do in one of these studies, but that's just from my perspective anyway.
Oh, certainly. And I think those kind of things are helpful. I don't know that I don't know that it ultimately that becomes a tactical decision rather than a strategic one, I think, because what we're thinking about is this is my guess. This is purely my guess. My guess is the predominance of the kids are actually to the left of the average. But we've got some kids who are riding really long, right, that are dragging the average up overall. So what we would want to think about is, can we assign a small bus to that? Does it make sense? Can we essentially lop off the tails and then focus on the core with bigger buses? That's certainly, but that's a tactical question, I think, in terms of the way that you're trying to go about doing this. It also is a contractual question, right? Because you may want to design the RFP, design the contract different in terms of the kind of assets that you're asking for. So I would argue that it is absolutely a worthwhile thing to do. It's absolutely a worthwhile thing to think about. But from an overall perspective, the value trade-off that you're making, which I think is the right framework to think about this, is, are we willing to expend X number of dollars to impact Y number of kids? Right? And because if it's one kid, it probably isn't worth $500,000, right? But if it's 500 kids, it might be. Anything?
Question too,
Yeah.
please. So one of our schools, Montgomery, has 4 bus routes, but only 2 buses. So each bus has a first load and a second load. So there's staggered arrival and departure times in the morning and afternoon. I honestly don't know if any of our other schools do that, but I wondered if that sort of system has been considered in any of this, in lieu of adding more buses, because you're just still using one bus, but to reach more routes.
Yeah. So I think, again, I think that's a reasonable tactical thing to do. I think from a service perspective, it's probably not the way you would want to go about doing it, because at some point there is a waiting period for that second load of kids that has to be managed at the school and has all of its own complications and so forth. And so, we can accommodate that through changing bell times if we wanted to, or whatever. But I think
it's already accommodated though through our after school programs, and
Sure.
it's usually constituted, or it's a recess time basically for those finite periods of time. But again, I mean, I don't know how that would look in maybe larger schools with longer times.
Right.
I don't know if we're just able to do it in Montgomery because we're so small, but yet so spread out. So
Yeah, yeah, and again, I think it's actually sort of similar in that I don't know that it's something you could do. Well, I don't think, in fact, that it's something that you could do systemically. But everything that you're doing like that is what is contributing to that relatively efficient level of cost and that relatively efficient use of the assets, right? So it's why we're extremely cautious about suggesting that there's a lot of disruption that you would want to add to the current system, because we think that it might cause more problems than it solves, actually, because it may disrupt something like this double tripping that's going on that is both culturally accommodated because it's been around and that is useful from an efficiency standpoint. But I didn't see and don't think that there's a lot of other places where that would layer in super well. Okay, so one of the other pieces, obviously, that we were looking at is looking at how to accommodate broader elements of high school choice options. And again, as we are thinking about this from a timing perspective, we are constrained in terms of the time and distance that we have to travel. And that's evident actually in how you're providing the services already, where there is, in essence, sort of an underlying shuttle system that exists to accommodate some of the transfers already. And ultimately, we think that's actually the right way to think about this, which is to look at a shuttle system in order to be able to try to implement some transfers amongst the towns to be able to accommodate sort of the broad choice program. The way that we focused on it, because at least in our assessment, the biggest challenge is thinking about Sheldon and its furthest point to Richford and trying to accommodate that. And also obviously trying to accommodate it into Enosburg. But so in thinking about it from what is effectively a worst constraint standpoint, that's the way that we have tried to model out some available options, right? The options that we modeled out were effectively two in nature. One is thinking about having dedicated shuttle buses servicing both schools from the Sheldon area, and then we would have to be turning some around in the other directions too, I suspect. But then also thinking about it in terms of just a single dedicated shuttle. So it may be more than one bus, but it's one methodology, right? So if we had, for example, 60 kids who wanted to go, we may have to run two buses, but they would follow essentially the same path, right? That's the way we think about it from a combined standpoint. And when we think about a shuttle system, it's important to keep in mind a couple of really elemental aspects of putting the system together. The first one is, how long does it take to get from point A to point B, right? And point A for us is typically defined as a school location. And the reason for that is because it's a controlled environment. It's a controlled environment that we own. It's a controlled environment that we're covered under a whole bunch of various elements, like what happens if somebody slips and falls, what happens if we have an issue in the parking lot, do we have people to attend, blah, 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 right? So when we're thinking about shuttle locations that are the point A to the point B, we have to think about where it is and how long does it take to get from one point to the other. And then in addition to that, we also have to think about how long does it take for the kids to get off the buses that they're coming into the transfer point onto the bus that they are taking the shuttle to, right? So similar to the way we think about arrivals and departures in the morning, we typically leave around 10 minutes to be able to do that. And that assumes that the buses get to the shuttle point at the right time and that the shuttle bus is able to depart. And then the last piece of this that we have to think about is things that work really well in the morning may not work really well in the afternoon, right? And we'll have some examples to be able to talk about that. So the shuttle system in general has to work for both ends of the day, right? For this to be a viable option. And when we were modeling out, again, you know, from our perspective, the assumptions that are built into the routing analysis that we did is just from a distance perspective, you know, roughly 30 minutes from Sheldon to Richford on its own, roughly 15 minutes from Sheldon to Enosburg on its own. I mentioned this loading and unloading time. We've got 10 minutes on both ends for that. And then if we were to combine them into a single shuttle vehicle, the amount of time that would be required for us was around 51 minutes, so around 50 minutes, 51 minutes. And that's to get from Sheldon to Enosburg, drop the kids off there, do the transfer, drive up to Richford, and then drop the kids off there, right? So you see 13 plus 10 plus 18 plus 10, right? That gets us to 51 minutes overall. So it's that temporal consideration that then goes into when do schools have to start and end to try to be able to accommodate a system like this. Right? So when we think about it, if we just take some simplified versions of this in the morning, and we assume existing.
I got another quick question. Did you
Sure.
look at Bakersfield at all when you did this?
Well, so the hardest one for us to model was this one, which is why I'm presenting this one.
Okay.
But yeah,
All right.
I'm sorry. So the answer is systemically, we looked at it across the system. It's this one though that creates the biggest challenge to putting it in as part of a sort of district-wide option, I guess is the best way to describe it.
Okay, but I'm having a little trouble understanding why it's so harder in Sheldon to Enosburg to Richford than it is from Bakersfield to Enosburg to Richford.
Yeah, so for us, it's the length of the rides that matter, and it's the length of the rides in the aggregate, right? Because, and we'll talk about some of that as we go through the rest of this.
Okay.
Okay. So let's assume for a second that we've got Sheldon Elementary at its current time, 7:45, with the 10-minute arrival. That means we get there at 7:35, right? If what we have, again, and this is sort of to address the starting point of the question, if for the sake of argument, we've got 45-minute on average ride times here, which is probably a little long, but we're going to have some kids that have that kind of a length. The ride time clock is still ticking at that point, right? When we get to the transfer point. And then we've got what is effectively this 10-minute transfer that we talked about, where kids would come off the buses at the elementary school and get on to the shuttle transfer for the high schools. So our 7:35 would have shuttles departing at 7:45, schools starting at the elementary school at 7:45. Arriving at the destination school somewhere between 8 and 8:15, again, just depending on which direction they're going, right? So now we may have ride times that are as much as 70 minutes already by the time we get to the school, right? So that's, one way. So 70 minutes in the morning, potentially 70 minutes in the afternoon. In one instance, in another instance, it may be as much as 90 minutes as the layout is. So
Can I ask another question?
sure.
So like in this scenario, they're arriving at Sheldon Elementary at 7:35, but they've arrived there from another bus, correct?
Yeah,
So they could have potentially been on another bus for like an hour, and then you're adding the shuttle time onto that. Okay.
Yeah, that's the length of, so to address both questions sort of at the same time, it's that full length of the ride issue that made this the most difficult thing for us to be able to look at, right? So, but yes, just in case my explanation so far hasn't been clear, your point is exactly the right one. So buses are converging from areas into an elementary school where elementary school kids are getting off and going into the building, and high school students, middle school students may be getting it would be getting off and potentially getting on a different bus to be able to go to the destination school, right? So there is, and again, this is one of the reasons why, and without belaboring it, it's one of the reasons why for us, the shuttle point is so important, because that has to be a controlled environment that we want to be responsible for, right? Which is why we picked the elementary schools to think about it from. So this is difficult in the morning, but doable. It's doable from a logistics standpoint. It will result in some long ride times, but it's manageable given the existing school hours. In the afternoon, things get more complicated because we have two challenges. We have differences in length of day at the schools, and we have the need to be there at a specific time, right? One of the things that the morning helps us with is maybe we get there at 7:30 instead of 7:35, and that's actually helpful from preparing the shuttle and so forth. This kind of instance, we refer to it as we've got to be there when the bell rings in the afternoon. And so from a design standpoint, it makes it more complicated. And we can see that just in the differences between the two arrows, right? We've got a 2:30 roughly, just for the sake of argument, finish at Enosburg. We've got a 2:45 finish at Sheldon. That actually works pretty well, right? The problem is on the other end, we've got because we have the length of day, right? So think about what we've done here. We've pushed out, I don't know if you can see the mouse, but we've pushed out these start times from where they are right now, right? So we're adding the 6 hour and 30-minute day or the 6 hour and 45-minute day to this new bell time that we have. And in doing so, what we end up with is some challenges in terms of managing it in the afternoon. When we start to think about in here in particular, we've got an elementary school that ends before the high school lets out and before the shuttle bus travels to that school. So if we were going to use this shuttle to transport home from Sheldon all of the PK to 12 kids, this bus that's picking those kids up would actually have kids waiting for it for 35 minutes at the elementary school, right? It's why the length of day creates such a complication in managing afternoon shuttles. Now, it's possible, again, to do these things, right? We can put parapros in buildings, we can, and these kind of things happen around the country. So that's the complication aspect of it. But it is a complication just you should be aware of, eyes open, going into thinking about how to do this, right? Without having to add significant numbers of additional assets, as we talked about, to be able to accommodate it, right? So what we would end up having is potentially an hour and 15-minute gap between bell time and departure, right? Which may be unacceptable. And if it is, it's going to be really hard to think about a system like this. So how would we accommodate that? We can think about synchronizing the bell schedules, which helps a little bit. That squeezes about 15 minutes of the difference out, because if you keep in mind, one of the things that we end up with here is we end up with high schools that finish roughly 40 minutes differently. And what that does to, teacher development and all those kind of other things. I don't have any idea. That's not my department, but I know that that's a thing that people worry about. So we would have this gap between when the high schools would end. We can fix some of that by aligning the start times and by aligning the length of day. And that helps some, but doesn't certainly reduce all of the problems. We can add additional assets in order to be able to essentially try to take home the elementary school kids before the shuttle bus ever gets there, so that we're just taking essentially the shuttle buses directly back from the high school. That presents a little bit of a challenge, again, from the number of buses that we would need, but is an option in the afternoon. And alternatively, we can think about reorienting the way that the shuttle operates such that it is addressing potentially not going all the way out, but we've got drop-offs at the elementary school. And then from that point, and I'm not recommending this, but this is something that happens at other places. High school students in particular get a ride to the elementary school, then it's their responsibility to figure out how they get the rest of the way home. That's not a great solution when you've got kids living way away from the school, but it is a solution that some districts have thought about, right? So what we would see here is, in order to accommodate this shuttle structure, in order to accommodate the broader choice aspects of it, we would be introducing some complications into transportation that we would have to be able to manage that way. More than likely, the way we would manage them is through, I think, bell times and probably the need for some additional assets to address what we talked about at the beginning of this part of the conversation, which is kids who may be on the bus for 70 to 90 minutes, twice a day, every day, when the rest of the system is being accommodated at 60 minutes, right? So the other way to think about this is, what if we had, instead of buses going from one school to two schools, so instead of a one-to-many, if we had a one-to-one, where the bus was going from Sheldon to Enosburg and then up to Richford, and again, in our example that we're building out here, this doesn't help very much, but we wanted to be able to show the impact of it. We've got all the same basic considerations: arrivals, transfer, departure, arrivals, school time starting, which is only slightly later than it is now in the instance of Enosburg, but is notably later when we're thinking about Richford, right? Which makes the problem decidedly more challenging in the afternoon, where this does not work in the afternoon unless we were to dedicate a significant number of additional resources to the take-home aspect of it. So again, as we're thinking about how to accommodate shuttling and choice, the primary option to be thinking about shuttling and choice is having, for the most difficult constraint in the system, having dedicated routes. The remainder of your system will be accommodated in a manner similar, because that's what's happening now, but the impact, I think, is overall going to be less. So the last component of it, as this is just a restatement of some of the challenges on the shuttling aspect of it. This would require some pretty fundamental changes in the way we think about bell times and accommodation. After school services, in all of these scenarios, minus the last shuttle scenario, there still is the capability, were we to remain with this 4:45, 5 o'clock pickup times that we have, we can still accommodate those things. So I think we don't have to have a huge amount of disruption in that. And what we may be able to do in some instances, if we can shorten up some of these rides, we may actually be able to support that program a little bit more, because we would have assets available that would not be on routes any longer, right? So we can think about managing length of ride in order to be able to accommodate the after school services that we're looking at. But we don't see a huge amount of disruption to that unless there's a big switch in the bell times. Okay, so I think, again, anything with that, I'm happy to take whatever questions you have, either on those scenarios or just in general in terms of the things that we've seen, whatever may be best for the board.
And then maybe before people jump in on questions, let me set the stage of what I think the decision point for the board is tonight. As I think everybody on the board knows, we're in year 5 of a 3-year contract with Terracell. We've been rolling it over for the last couple of years, and you still have the option to continue to roll that over 1 year at a time at that inflationary factor. Or we could go and bid that out, that contract out as a whole. I think if you roll it over with Terracell, there is some constraint in that we couldn't put in the contract, we're going to add pre-K, or we're going to add after school, or the high school shuttle, because there's some limitations on how quickly that contract can grow. I think if this board decided to roll it over and then spend the summer looking at some of these options, and maybe we went to Terracell in the fall and wanted to pilot a few things, you know, we could add that to the contract without getting our hands slapped and just bid it out the following year. Heather Moore had to drop off, but I'll quickly maybe speak for Heather and speak for Melissa, and they can jump in terms of after school and pre-K. Heather had told me that she's most interested in exploring after school transportation for the older kids, so the 2 high school programs, one of which currently has that. So there's some concerns about taking kids home late at night for the after school program from the elementary schools. I think similarly, Melissa's done a lot of investigation into other systems. When Tim started asking me questions about pre-K, and I started asking them to Melissa. And I think the short story is that the ones that are providing transportation are sort of sorry that they went that route. And many of the other ones are not providing transportation. And there's some pretty specific requirements that you have to follow for pre-K. And then, you know, Lynn, I think, can jump in on the high school shuttle piece of it. It is definitely an equity issue, and we treat 2 towns differently from 2 other towns in our current system. But to riff off of one of the points that Rick was making, and I think Kat was tipping to as well, if you're in Sheldon and you're already spending an hour on a bus to get to the elementary school, and then you're going to spend an hour to get up to Richford, there's an equity argument to be made to say that you have that option, but really how many more resources do we want to put in to the possibility for a kid to spend 4 hours on a bus for that?
Oh, Lynn, I think you're muted.
I said it's interesting to see it laid out that way, to be able to just quantify what that would actually result in terms of ride time and just even the schedule piece of it. So I think that's something we would need to really think deeply about. Definitely the intention of this has been to think about how we can get more equitable opportunities for our students. And, you know, I personally need to digest that piece of it a little bit. And I think maybe that's something the board, what's the action you're asking for tonight? Are you asking for a specific action or an opportunity to come back to this?
So I don't know that we have an opportunity to punt a decision to bid it out and then still bid it out and get buses ready to go in August. So I think tonight I really need direction from the board. Either we're going to roll it over with Terracell at roughly the same type of contract, or we're going to bid it out, and what of these other pieces do you want included in that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I agree with Lynn. It's an awful lot to digest. It's so complicated, and there are a lot of different kind of versions and scenarios to explore. So for me, I feel like we need to, I kind of would prefer to decouple what we were just presented with from the immediate and kind of the more like the urgency around, we do have to make a decision around the contract with Terracell, because I think this would even warrant like a meeting unto itself, where this was the only agenda item or a subcommittee that really dove in. It raises a lot of really good and important questions, but I certainly don't feel capable of tearing into that conversation and having it kind of needing to impact the decision we make around Terracell tonight.
I agree with Mary, and I liked this overview. And like Tim said, I mean, this is sort of the big picture macro, but I do think it warrants a closer look and talking to each of the schools. I think each school is like, this isn't a one size fits all. We have such unique needs because of our diverse, you know, geography and layouts of these rural routes. So I would like to see the same, as Mary just said, like, you know, kind of a focus on this with some of our leaders too, maybe.
And to be fair, the principals have not had a chance to see this yet. And so any major changes to route, I do think you'd want their input. The one silver lining, I guess, if you will, from the work that Tim did is we went into this knowing that our transportation system was 6 separate contracts developed by 6 entities that has, slowly been kind of coupled together. And, we kind of went into it hoping that we might find some efficiencies now that we're really doing this at the SU level. I think, and Tim, you can correct me if I'm misinterpreting, but I think the story is that given the kids that we're transporting, we're actually doing a pretty good job by them.
Yes.
The contract we have.
Yeah. No, and again, I think conditionally as well, just given the environment and everything that's gone on over the last 2 years, which feels like 12, I guess. I think that's absolutely right. And the challenge of pulling off the 800 plus kids that you're doing every day is a really difficult one. And structurally, you're in a good place for it. And all of the outcomes, at least that we're seeing from it, indicate that whatever the partnership is that you have, the outcomes are positive.
And I think the other piece is that if we actually do end up having to transport every kid who's eligible per policy, we in Terracell are sort of hosed because I don't think there are enough drivers or buses in the county to accomplish that. So that's the worrisome part of the study.
Yeah. Which, again, and I mean, from a board perspective, right, one of the things that you may want to be thinking about is just getting a better understanding of that demand side of things, and having things like, not specifically opt-in out policies, but just sense of the community kind of things where you're serving parents and saying, hey, do you think you're going to use the system? No penalties, no harm, no foul, right? You got to get it worded the right way so that people don't say yes as a hedge, right? But just having a feel for how stable is that 800 number versus in a non-COVID environment nowadays, would you be at 1,000? Because if you were, that's a very different system than the one you're running right now, right? So just from a risk management perspective, thinking about it in those terms.
It's definitely an impact on ridership as a result of COVID. There's no question. There have been some families who have felt that, just safety wise, they would prefer not to put their kids in that really small space. And then there have been other families that didn't want their kids to have to mask or have the, cracked windows during the colder months. So there have been a lot of reasons why people have chosen to drive their children.
Mm-hmm.
So Morgan, can you clarify for me, the motion that you're needing tonight is around whether we're going to renew next year's contract with Terracell? But
Right.
it's only, it would
I
only
don't know.
be a year, it's only a year renewal. And
You're
it
only
doesn't,
allowed to renew year by year at this point.
and it doesn't preclude the possibility that if we got a smaller kind of working committee together with our building leaders focused on kind of really like analyzing the transportation study and kind of envisioning what we might like to change, it doesn't preclude our being able to circle back to Terracell and say, would we be able to, change these and shift these and pilot potential new routes for our preschoolers? I'm just saying hypothetically.
Yeah, I don't believe it does. I think if we did go that route, it probably would force our hand to bid it out the following year. But I think you could certainly do that.
And every time you say bid it out, I kind of chuckle because there's no one else to really bid it out to, right? I mean, it's Terracell or bust, eh?
That's the only bidder you got 5 years ago. There
Yeah.
are some national companies that we put the bid specs out to, and they did not they did not put a bid in on it. I don't know if that's because we're so rural or if this is a tight enough group that they call Terracel and they say, are you bidding again? And if they say, yeah, they take a pass. And if Terracel says no, they're going to come in because they're going to buy up all the buses and buy up all the drivers. But yeah, there are people, bruising the phone lines to tell me that they want a shot at bidding it.
Yes, okay. So, all right, well, I especially, Tim, want to thank you. That was really incredibly thorough and really illuminating. I can't imagine the amount of time and research that went into that. I really, I appreciate it. And I think it'll be enormously helpful as we try to kind of, brainstorm of how we can kind of improve our system. But I too, I echo, I think Morgan said, I'm happy to hear that all things considered and all the challenges we face in this really kind of rural and challenging geography, that we're doing a decent job, it sounds like, overall. Always room for improvement, of course. So thank you. That's
No, thank you. No, I mean, we certainly appreciate the opportunity to work with you all. It's as a transplanted New Englander, right? It's always nice to go back up and see the places I've been. So
great. Well, thank you so much. And I assume you're available at a future time if we wanted or needed any, as we kind of tear into all the data, if we
absolutely.
needed any clarification.
Yeah, we'll remain available, and Morgan and I communicate probably more than he wants to. So yeah, we'll be available as questions arise.
All right. Well, we appreciate all your time and expertise. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Tim.
Bye now.
So my sense from the people who spoke is that the direction you want to give me is to roll over the contract with Terracel. Lynn and I can work with principals, maybe pull a couple of people from the board, and Tim and his group to the extent we need that level of analysis, and see if we can come up with some other options. And I should add to that Melissa and Heather as well for those programs.
Yeah, and I was a little confused. I mean, yes, Morgan, I think that's the motion we'll make in a second. And that sounds like a good strategy. I think it would be worthwhile to, we could have it be an entire board discussion, or I think a handful of board members plus the leaders, plus you, plus Lynn and Heather and Melissa, especially in light of the conversations around after school and the little ones. I was a little confused about Heather's component there, because I was I understand that we don't provide busing after school, like that if you're in an after school program, aren't parents required to then pick up students?
So, and I'll apologize on her behalf, she had to hop to another meeting, but currently the Enosburg High School program provides some level of transportation after their program. The Richford site does not, but that's something that she's been actively looking into in terms of, trying to track down grants that would provide that. The elementary school sites do not provide that transportation.
The big question there, Mary, is also about access. So there are some families that without the transportation, there isn't a possibility for those students to participate in that program. So through that lens of equity and making sure that this is an opportunity that's available to everyone, that's why we asked to have them explore whether or not transportation could be feasible.
And are you saying, Lynn, that equity piece, that's across the board at all of our sites for all of the kids doing after school? So even Montgomery, Bakersfield, even at the elementary age?
Yeah, so the grants were written based on what the priorities were in each school at the time we applied for the last 21C round of funding. So Enosburg Elementary had transportation in the grant, as did Enosburg Middle High School. So we removed the transportation at Enosburg Elementary School. It stayed at the high school, but that brings the question of participation and access in those programs in all of the other schools in terms of how many students aren't participating and accessing this that otherwise could, if there was a way for us to navigate transportation. I don't think everyone would need the transportation. So I don't think that we're talking a complete running of all those full loops again. But it might be that you have the way Enosburg did it was one bus at the end of the program, and they went out and did the drop-offs at the end because it was a much smaller number of students that needed the ride that were participating.
Well, I mean, and I do feel like if that's something that we're offering in one school, it's something we should offer in all of the school. It begs the question of whether we should be offering that in all of the schools so that all the kids who want to participate in after school can then have the transportation. I mean, it's just, yeah. So, which that to me, I feel as though that would get significantly more costly, but something we would want to consider.
Agreed.
Yeah, the only other thing I'd like to add is just taking in mind a little bit what Kat said. I don't think that we need to do everything everywhere all the same. So there may be some places that it makes sense to do, some schools it makes sense to do some things, and other schools that it might make sense to do other things, and just because we can't do it everywhere, doing it some places is probably better than doing it no places, some of these things. So I think people should keep that in mind.
I think part of this too, Rick, is doing some of the work. Heather and I have had these conversations about what's the data, what do we have that supports a need or not a need in each of our communities for that additional route of transportation. I think that that's what you're suggesting, Rick. It doesn't necessarily have to be.
Yeah, or it might be that, yeah, so exactly. But there might be, so say for example, Montgomery, you brought up was running 2 different bus routes, right? Well, it might be that Richford can run 2 different bus routes, and, have an elementary school and you put your pre-K kids on that elementary school bus, and, then have a different route for the high school kids, I mean, there might be stuff like that that's out there that's worth doing. The way it was presented, overall, I'm certainly not really in favor of having pre-K kids on the bus for 90 minutes 2 times a day. I mean, I just think that's just not feasible, but it may work in certain, things like that may work in certain schools and not as the SU as a whole. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
So it seems like this is definitely a big conversation, or many big conversations. So I think we can, it'd be helpful for me to get a sense from the board if everyone wants to be involved in the kind of analysis of the transportation study and the brainstorming around if we're going to change things, what exactly are we going to change, and whether everyone wants to do that, in which case maybe we would want to do a special meeting that's just about transportation, or if we want to come up with a committee, a handful of board members, building leaders, and other interested parties.
So my opinion is that maybe Lynn can pick 1 or 2 things that maybe she would think that's most feasible to try, and then maybe get some people together that would be involved with those, building heads and that kind of stuff that's involved in those projects. I would start with that because, right, I mean, I don't know what we're trying to, right now, I don't know what we're trying to solve, right? We're trying to provide pre-K, we're trying to provide shuttle service to different high schools. I don't know what Lynn is thinking as far as where we should concentrate our efforts.
So Lynn doesn't know that either, because these are asked them to give us some information about each of these areas. These have come up as, you know, if we had the capacity to do this, it would be really nice to be able to provide transportation for these 3 circumstances. So now we need to look at, you know, you need to look at the resources that you have available, and then you also need to look at how many students would this impact? Like, what's the, I feel like we have to do some digging now. So
Yeah,
if
yeah, I
we
do too.
surveyed Sheldon students and said, I mean, maybe it's current Sheldon 9th through 11th graders and this year's 8th grade. If Richford High School was an option for you, not that you're committing, but would you want to be able to consider attending Richford High School? If you've got 15 kids that say, yeah, I want to do that, then that to me bumps up into a higher priority than if you had 2 that said, I want to be able to do that.
No,
So
I think,
go ahead.
well, no, I was gonna say, I mean, I think another, I guess before we look to like add too much and kind of going back to Rick's, one of his first questions about, you know, who are the students that are experiencing 90-minute one-way, you know, ride times? Like, hopefully it's not a lot of kids, but like looking at our existing, like, what are we working with right now? And are there ways that we can improve that with what we have? And then look at, you know, okay, can we add high school busing for ASP, and can we add preschool? So that's where I would want to start.
Did he present that though? I think he talked about taking it from 90 to 60. That was a lot of data, a lot of information. The way I was interpreting it, it would add, did he say 60?
He was also going in the 2 first scenarios, going under the assumption of having like full capacity or like another 600 students. So it's, again, it's like, I feel like we now need to really look at the individual systems and what each school is kind of running with. And then, yeah, there is the COVID layer that's obviously impacted it. But I think if you look at Montgomery versus Sheldon, or even Enosburg versus Richford, you're just going to find a very unique set of needs in each community based on just so much of the data, the routes themselves, where do the roads go? And yeah, how many kids do you really have? And out of all those kids, how many are riding that long?
So I think the 3rd scenario tried to get at that, the same number of kids and get down to an hour ride time. But as he pointed out, he's got the entire list of students. So his model's making some assumptions about which kids are riding. He doesn't actually know that there are kids getting on it at these stops this year every day. So in a place like Montgomery, it matters pretty significantly if we're bringing kids down from Alpine Haven or not.
I mean, I would like to see all of the leaders presented with this, or at least have an opportunity to review the slideshow and then, you know, bring us all together, whether it's them and a few of us or all of us. I mean, whatever people want, but because I think people on the ground level are going to obviously, you know, really know their current system. And, you know, one school might say like, there's no problems. And another school might say, no, like we have so many problems with X, Y, Z. So I think now really bringing it to that ground level is, yes, important.
We also in early ed have licensing regulations we need to follow, and that includes a 45-minute time limit on a bus one way for preschoolers. There's staff ratio that we have to look at. So there are a lot of factors that are regulations that we would have to kind of take that micro look at, not the macro look at, and say, okay, how long are these kids actually on the bus? And even a 45-minute bus ride, is that developmentally appropriate for a 3 or 4-year-old? So there are things to consider.
I'd rather see shuttles for the little kids. I mean, when I was a kid, we had like the mini bus in Sheldon, and it just, you know, was for, I think at that time it was kindergarten actually, because we were half days. That was a long time ago.
Well, and that's the other piece too. Most of the preschool programs don't fall in line with the same full day schedule that the rest of the school does. So you'd be looking at potentially another bus unless we extended the day. But in Sheldon, they do still do the half-day programs for pre-K. They have an AM and PM. So then you're looking at more bus routes.
Melissa, did you say that in your research, you found that a lot of other area schools do not provide to pre-K?
It was a mix. Some do, some don't. Some wish they didn't, just because it does get so messy with licensing. There's some gray area. I had even called licensing about the language around when you drop a child off and who can or can't be present. And essentially the way it's written in the regulations, you can drop off a child 3 or 4 years old to nobody, but that's just that specific language. But then when you look elsewhere in the regulations, it's regarding the safety of the whole child at all times. So the language can get really dicey, and there are other factors that just it just gets really messy. And they don't have to wear seat belts. Buses, public buses, school buses, they're exempt from that, unless there are restraints offered. So like if every seat had seat belts, then they'd have to be properly within those restraints. So there's just a bunch. They said it just can get really messy and complicated.
And just one more question, sorry, I know we're probably trying to wrap this up, but with regards to his recommendation on the insurance and that liability piece that was missing for us, is that something that we would be like looking into right off to add to our insurance?
Yeah, I would run it by Visbit and see what their feeling is on that. But I don't imagine it would be a problem. We'd probably have to wait until we bid it out again to make that change to the contract, but we could certainly ask Carousel if it would be a big deal for them to add it if it's something that they don't have. And it may be something that they've already got. It's just kind of buried in their general liability.
All right, so I know there's a lot more to discuss, but it's also almost 8, and I want to be mindful of the late hours. So what it seems to me is we'll do the motion on the contract in just a second. And I'm hearing that we need some sort of like smaller committee, and certain Lynn and Melissa, Heather, Morgan, and our building principals to meet at some point, or try to kind of develop a little bit of a timetable. Maybe Lynn, you and I could work on that and kind of just outline what that might look like, how many meetings we might like to have over the course of, the remainder of this school year, and even through, through the summer, so that we can have something kind of definitive to possibly kind of reach out to Terracell with enough time that if we want to try to do anything, make any fundamental changes prior to August, we would just want to think about like, what does that time frame look like? And so from board members, I mean, I would be happy to be on that committee. Is there anyone else who might like to have a voice in that? And certainly we would bring anything back to the full board when, before we make any substantial and especially kind of financially consequential changes. Okay, so no real interest from anyone else on the board at this point to kind of dialogue with Lynn, Morgan, and others about the busing. All right. So I'll do that with you, Lynn and Morgan, and we'll make a kind of timeline and figure out what the strategy is going to look like. And then I'll just make the motion to.
So I think the motion would be to direct me to negotiate an additional year on the Terracell transportation contract.
All right, that's the motion that I'm making. By roll, Kat.
Aye.
Emily,
Aye.
Rick,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye. Great, thank you. All right, Morgan, so you've got your financial update and a few other things.
Yeah, and so the other motion I need is around the supervisory union treasurer. As we told you earlier this year, Mary Dusso is retiring at the end of March, and she is who you named as your treasurer. And then the NMV board has named, whoever is in the SU treasurer position to be their treasurer. So I would ask for a motion to designate Fran Jackson as treasurer for the supervisory union. And then this is something that we will revisit in your reorganization meeting whenever we hold that.
I will make
Make
the
that
motion.
I think that was Rick who made the motion. By roll, Kat,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
Rick,
Aye.
Emily,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye.
And everything else that I have is informational.
Informational, but you don't need to share it, or you are going to share it.
Nope, it's in your packet. And so
Okay.
unless there are questions, I don't need to add anything to it.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Morgan. All right, Lynn, you're up.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to go speedy where I can in this agenda because I'm aware that you've been at it for 2 hours. So under personnel, you have two action items. The first is I'd ask the board to make a motion to hire Ann Whitney, or I don't know how to say the middle name, or Elena Whitney, as the ELL teacher for the 22-23 school year. I should
I'll
say
make that
beginning.
motion. What's that, Lynn?
I said for the 22-23 school year. I should say beginning in the 22-23 school year.
Okay. I'll make that motion. By roll, Emily,
Aye.
Rick,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
Kat,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye.
And then the next piece, there's a lot of informational personnel information that's in your packet. The one thing that isn't informational, it's actually action, is the reduction in force notice. We did this at each of your local boards, but we did not do this at the SU level. So this is the time of the year where we notify the union that should we need to, we could contemplate reductions. So be looking for the board to make the motion to direct the superintendent to send a letter to the Cold Hollow Education Association president notifying him that the board may contemplate a reduction in force.
I'll make the motion.
Thanks, Kevin. By roll, Kat,
Aye.
Emily,
Aye.
Rick,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye.
Next up on my agenda is school year 22-23 calendar. I sent you 2 calendar templates, and the first is a traditional look at a school calendar, and that's the way we have historically scheduled our year in marking periods or quarters. So the concept that you had approved in previous years around early release days, those are still embedded in that calendar. We have SU in-service days that are embedded in there. There's nothing, this is just an SU view of a school calendar, so there are no local in-service days embedded here. The principals do that afterwards, and so that would develop a school-specific calendar. In general, there's not a lot that has changed significantly on this school calendar for next year. The February vacation is a little funky, only because of where it falls in the calendar. So most of it happens in March next year. Other than that, it is pretty typical. The beginning of school the last Wednesday in August is something that we've been doing for a while. And that puts us to August 31st next year. That's the only other thing that's kind of out of the ordinary, just in terms of dates, but not our pattern. So what I've given you this time is this traditional view of calendar. And then I've also given you a concept that we're considering, and that's around exploring a trimester for our pre-K through 8, a trimester driven calendar for our pre-K through 8 schools and our pre-K through 5 schools, not for either of the middle high schools. It's very complicated with shared schedules and high schools and middle schools. So this is something that Sheldon currently does. They have a trimester calendar, and we have sent out a survey to see what kind of interest there is from our staff in exploring something like this. So just wanted to put it in front of the board to see if there's any major objection to us exploring a trimester model for our pre-K through 8 and our pre-K through 5 schools. So far, I've given them until Friday, but I've received 58 responses from staff members. And right now, 79.3% of our staff members are in favor of a shift to a trimester model. And that I only have surveyed the teachers who would be impacted by this shift. So I'm really asking the board to tell me if you have any major concerns about exploring the trimester move, and then just to approve the calendar itself, not necessarily whether it's trimester or marking period, but just to approve the general layout of the calendar and where the leave days are and the professional learning days.
Lynn, can you share a little bit about, why or what the benefits might be of a trimester over a semester calendar, and why some schools choose one over the other?
Sure. So right now, the only reason that we have a school with a trimester calendar is when Sheldon came to FNESU, they've been within a system that used trimesters for years. So we did not tell them that they had to shift to a marking period based calendar. We let them stick with what they have. One of the benefits of shifting to a trimester calendar is some increased instructional time. So if you think about how much time teachers spend on doing the more formal assessments, they're assessing all the time formatively, but the more formal assessments connected to the marking and reporting periods, when you shift to a trimester model, you gain some instructional time. The other piece is that we have a district common assessment plan that is divided into 3 times a year. This would align better to what our common assessment plan is. So you still would have opportunities 6 times a year to be communicating with families about progress students are making, but you would gain some additional instructional time. Some of the comments that I'm seeing from teachers have to do with, the amount of time that it feels like there are some marking periods that it comes so quickly. I think one is between the first and the second marking period, the second and the third marking period, but certainly that first marking period comes really quickly because you've just begun school. You're still setting expectations. You're doing your first 6 weeks of school, and then you're at a reporting period. So you lose instruction every time you get to that point where you're having to really dig in and do more of those formal assessments. So those are some of the primary reasons that we've talked about, even exploring this idea.
And Lynn, can you clarify, you're saying you're exploring it for the pre-K through 8 and the pre-K through 5 schools, but then you also said that it's challenging at the high school and the middle school level. So I was just a little confused. So, but if in the pre-K through 8 buildings, this would be for all students,
Yes.
not just the pre-K through 5 within a pre-K through 8
Right.
building.
So it's all the NMV schools plus Richford Elementary and Enosburg Elementary.
Okay.
The added complexity is the shared staffing. When you have Richford Junior High and Richford High School, it's the same staff. So the high schools function on a semester model. So if you moved your high school or you moved your middle school to a trimester model and your high school was at a semester model, it would really complicate the shared staffing assignments. So that's true in both of the high schools. It's not something that I'm recommending that we explore at either of those schools.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And so then the motion that you need, Lynn, is just to approve the kind of bones of the calendar with the
Correct.
instructional days, the holidays, because none of those will shift, even if we ultimately decide to transition to a trimester system.
Correct.
Okay. Well, so I'm happy to make that motion to accept the calendar. By roll, Emily,
Aye.
Rick,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
Kat,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye.
Okay, next I want to share with you. Oops, I think can you see my screen? Are you even able to see the mission, vision, goals?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So the SU board and actually all three boards were invited to participate in a board retreat. This is taken us a little longer than we had expected. We've had some COVID starts and stops, but we've been working on developing a mission, vision, and goals for the SU. That could be kind of the overarching, these are the things we're all working on together. So the group that has been working on these I sent these in your board packets. They have come up with the vision. We've also looked at the mission and the goals, and we're asking for the board to make these formal, because as of right now, these are all still in draft form. So what I'm projecting for you right now is the vision that this group landed on. So in FNESU, we're working collaboratively with staff, students, and the community to achieve an equitable, responsive learning environment, which prepares all students for lifelong success. FNESU is committed to being a community where students want to learn, families want to live, and educators and staff want to teach and work. So I don't know, Mary, do you want me to go through all of it and ask for approval on the whole gamut, or take this one at a time?
I guess we could do it one at a time, so that at least we get some, in case there's some people who aren't happy with it as it stands, we get some checked off our list.
Okay.
So I'll make the motion that we approve the vision goal.
Great, thanks, Rick. By roll, Kat,
Aye.
Rick,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye. Unfortunately, Emily had to leave, so we're down to the four of us.
So here is the mission. This is the mission that has been in place in FNESU, and we're not proposing changes to that. Schools in the Franklin Northeast Supervisory Union provide equitable, inclusive, and personalized learning opportunities for all students. Educators facilitate learning by using assessment data to provide feedback to learners, personalize instruction, and allow for self-paced opportunities to develop and demonstrate proficiency. Student wellness and achievement is our collective priority and responsibility.
I like that. I'm happy with that, and I'll make a motion to accept that mission statement. By roll, Kat,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
Rick,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye.
And finally, the board goals. We've had lengthy conversations about making sure that the goals reflect our values. And so you see the all students in each of these goals, because this is something that we've been talking about and working hard on as a supervisory union, that all really does mean all, and that we're working hard to make sure that all students have whatever supports they need in order to be able to meet the goals. So the board came up with a goal around literacy, graduation requirements, and social emotional learning. So by June of 2027, all students in FNESU will be reading on grade level by the end of third grade. By June of 2027, all students in FNESU will complete high school by demonstrating proficiency in graduation requirements as reflected in their personalized learning plan. By June of 2027, all students in FNESU will demonstrate proficiency by the end of each grade level band on the social emotional learning priority standards.
I just have one question on number 2. Does this literally mean that like all students will complete high school? Like, meaning like nobody would drop out, or am I just like reading too much into that?
So this is the aspirational goal, that it's all students are going to complete high school by demonstrating proficiency. There are some students who meet that goal in a different way, Kat. So some students meet that graduation requirement through Vermont Adult Learning. Some students meet that graduation requirement through GED, early college, in other ways. So
Okay.
it is really centered on getting all of them through.
Okay.
And some students have graduation requirements that are defined on their IEPs. So it also includes whatever the graduation requirements that are defined in their personalized IEP would reflect.
I'll make the motion to approve the board goals.
Thanks, Kat. By roll, Rick,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
Kat,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye.
I'm gonna stop sharing so I can go back to see my notes. So the next piece of this is at the April meeting, I'm going to bring you a draft of a board monitoring plan so that you can see what the plan is for the 23-24 school year in terms of what our baseline data is going to look like and how frequently you can expect to have reports coming to you that are kind of demonstrating where we are in terms of attaining those goals. So I'll bring that draft next month. Do have a negotiations piece on here, and Mary, when you did prioritization earlier, I should have tuned into this doesn't require everyone for this part. So I wonder if the board would be amenable to moving this to the end of your board business tonight so we can let others jump off.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine.
Okay. So in terms of a legislative update, you all are receiving the VSBA update, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. There are 2 pieces that I just want to talk about tonight. The first is S-126, and that's a bill that has some momentum in the legislature. It's going through the Senate. There's another bill that has a similar intention also going through the House. So essentially what this is being driven by teachers and by the NEA. They're allowing for, or they're asking that teachers be allowed to break contract at any point or by a date that is much later than what we would typically be comfortable with. So right now in your master agreement, we get contracts out on April 15th. Teachers have to return them by May 1st. Anyone can ask for a 2-week extension, which gets them to May 15th. So we know by May 15th where all the openings are in our supervisory union. When we don't find out until May 15th, we really struggle with a candidate pool. This bill, it's different in both the House and the Senate, could result in something like that date not being until June 15th. Which would mean that teachers would have the ability to, even if they sign their contract, to keep looking and break their contract through June 15th, which would result in us trying to hire without having the benefit of having people come in and teach, without having staff available to us to participate in search committees, and in a time where everyone is already under contract, and most of the college grads have been under contract. So it would likely result in us having to find people not in education and get them provisionally licensed to fill some of the teaching positions that we have. So I think that you hear us talk about, and you'll hear it across the country, people talking about the staffing shortage around education in general. And I think that this bill could be incredibly detrimental to us and to our organization, to our reality. What we have right now, when we have openings, we have anywhere between 0 and 3 candidates that apply for many of those positions. I actually took a screenshot of our recent school spring listings, and we just do not have a lot of candidates because of where we are geographically, and other factors that we've talked about in terms of compensation as well. So I'm very worried about this bill. So I'm asking you to just keep your eyes on it. And if it's something that you're feeling like you want to reach out to the VSBA and communicate if you have concerns about this bill moving forward and what it would potentially do to us in FNESU, please feel free to do so. I've been pretty verbal myself about this bill because I just feel like this is going to create barriers. It's going to disadvantage kids who are already disadvantaged. So it's going to hit systems like ours where we're not going to be able to hire. And it's going to benefit systems like systems that are better resourced in Chittenden County, where they're going to be able to draw from a pool that would include many educators because they'd be allowed to break their contract. So it could be pretty detrimental to us. So I'll keep you posted on that. The other is pupil waiting. I don't have a ton to offer, Morgan. I know you were following that a little more closely than I was at the end of last week. I don't know if you want to add anything in there about pupil waiting.
I know it's being fast tracked. The draft that I saw would take effect not this July 1, but next July 1. And they're contemplating a 5-year phase in to the so-called appropriate weights, which I find frustrating because it's 5 years of working under a system that we know is inequitable. But if that's what it takes to get this passed this year, I think it's probably worth not fighting that. So as we've mentioned, no matter how the final version sugars off, it's going to likely benefit both of our communities. And actually a 5-year phase in will, I think, allow us to kind of ease into some of those discussions around whether the legislature's intention is to use this to drive down tax rates or increase opportunities for kids who historically haven't had them.
So it's a bill where, as you can imagine, we've talked about this a lot with you. We are very interested in this bill. And I think our biggest concern is that they do something, that they move forward quickly with this bill. They can't let it not pass and then create a lengthier timeline for when this will actually come to fruition. Any questions on any of that? So next up, I just want to, Gab gave a beautiful report in your board packet around the details of our Flexible Pathways Academy and the opportunities that students have had. She gave you some data in terms of the number of students that are accessing that program. She also gave you data about the number of students how much we've expanded the high school part of that program. We have drawn in some tuition students that otherwise would not have come to us. So my intention, unless I hear from you a direction to go in another way, is to continue with that program. There've been some benefits to that program that were kind of unintended positive consequences. So one in particular is Michelle Tiberge has come to you a few times over the last couple of years and has talked to you about the specialized programs that she's been building that are embedded within our schools and the program that she put at the Monteith House. The challenge we have when we build some of those programs, especially the one at the Monteith House, is we don't then have teachers to shift there to be able to be the teachers who are providing the direct instruction. So because we have this Flexible Pathways Academy, we have licensed teachers. So we have the availability of these students being able to participate in our Flexible Pathways Academy while they're transitioning and in some of these specialized programs within FNESU. So I wanted you to ask any questions that you needed to ask about the FPA model, and just give me an indication if you're in the same boat in terms of moving forward with supporting this program.
Well, I mean, I read through Gab's report and the numbers look look really excellent. And I mean, I know it's a little hard to predict how they're going to potentially shift as we get further from kind of the thick of the pandemic. But it seems that they've only, even as things have eased a little pandemic wise, we are still getting new enrollment in it. Am I understanding that part correctly, Gab?
I think 7-12 especially.
Yeah. And then that we have two new tuition students as well. So it seems as though we're kind of drawing attention from even kind of outside of our immediate community, eh?
We have 10 tuition students total from high school. It's hard to say, I guess, like when they come in. Do you know what I mean? If you're drawing them or not. Does that make sense? Like they are going to Enosburg or Richford and choosing to be in flexible pathways.
Okay, I misunderstood that thing.
But there
I
are,
appreciate you clarifying that.
I mean, we do have several who, I think we have 2 from Berkshire who would have probably done something completely different. I think they would have done CDP.
Okay.
So we do have kids who came to us specifically for FPA.
Yeah.
But I think we've got more students who are in either Enosburg or Richford and are choosing to join FPA as an option.
So do you see do you have a sense of the high school students that have come like mid-year or whatever? I mean, are they cases where they may have dropped out or may have homeschooled, or I mean, do you have a sense of that, I guess, when people sign up?
I think most of the kids that we're getting right now are coming from the early years of their high school career. They're finding out about flexible pathways either through guidance or interactions through freshman academy experiences. And they're learning about it because they're using the alternative transcript.
And is this something that is going to be presented to the 8th graders? Like the way that Nate would present, Cold Hollow to 8th graders as an option?
It has been presented to the 8th graders a few years in a row. It's a little bit tough for kids and parents to understand it, I think, especially at the high school level. And so it takes a little bit of time and practice in creating evidence and getting a handle on the transcript at the high school level anyway, to sort of understand how it works and how it's different from maybe a traditional path. So that's been what we've noticed. I think they're coming in midway through the year because they sort of gain some experience with it in their traditional high school experience, and then they're sort of like, oh, this seems like it might be a good fit for me.
Great. Anyone else want to ask questions of Gab or Lynn about flexible pathways? Well, I for one am supportive of it. I mean, I think it's really extraordinary what you've done, Gab, and I think it fills a really important and obviously a needed niche in our community. So, so if there's no other discussion, Lynn, you said we do need a motion on this, eh?
Yeah, I would like you to take action.
Okay. I will make the motion to, and Lynn, let me just clarify, because this was originally done as a pilot, and now we are contemplating, like, are we wanting to kind of codify this moving forward in perpetuity, or are we just going to say we're going to do it for the 2022-23 school year, and it'll be kind of an ongoing like assessment year to year?
I think, with a program like this, we're going to have to continue to look at numbers and participation, and I think that nothing is really in perpetuity. Even if you approve it and say, we're good with you moving forward with this program, I'm going to continue to work with Gab and with her staff. And if we get to a place where we see a significant drop in participation, I would come back to you and say, we're going to move. I'm going to recommend that you move in another direction. But
Yeah.
I'm bringing this back to you today because we did say that last year that the board was approving a 1-year pilot. So I'm open to however the board wants to move this tonight, whether you just say we're going to approve us going forward, and if we need to, we'll reevaluate, or you tell me to come back next February.
And Morgan, budget wise, because it was only a pilot, you didn't know, did you build the budget with the Flexible Pathways Academy in mind for the 2 districts?
So we did not, but we are currently paying for that out of ESSER money. And we're going to be able to do that for another year at least.
Okay. So I think that then for me, given that it's coming out of ESSER money and what Morgan said, we can pay for it for another year, it seems wise then to say we will kind of renew it for the 2022-23 school year. And then we'll probably have to have a deeper conversation when we're crafting our budget in the fall and early winter about, if we're going to then need to kind of transition from ESSER funding into kind of the regular general fund, or however we're going to fund it. That seems like worthwhile. So rather than kind of codifying it moving forward, since funding seems like it will need to shift a bit, then the motion that I feel comfortable making is one to continue the Flexible Pathways Academy for the 22-23 school year. So by roll, Kat,
Aye.
Rick,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
Emily,
Aye.
and Mary is an aye.
So one thing that I'll just put this under other. Thank you, by the way. I did not introduce Vern at the start of this meeting. This is his first FNESU board meeting. And I don't know if Vern is behind that screen right now or if he stepped away for a second, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this is his first meeting. This is the first facilities director report, and you'll be hearing from him in some of your district meetings coming up as he's working through his longer term facilities planning. So Vern, do you want to just say hi to the board?
Hi guys, nice to meet you all. Morgan and I have pretty much gone through most of the NMV schools to just create kind of a 3 to 5 year program. Basically what we're trying to prioritize as far as projects coming up in the near future. Basically just getting comfortable with all the schools right now. We've got a lot of stuff going on as far as deferred maintenance and things that need to be addressed. But we're making pretty good strides on it. I think it's going to take a while, obviously, but we're going after some grants for some refrigeration. So basically, right now, the NMV schools we've really concentrated on, and Morgan and I'll hopefully in the near future be working a little closer to see where we can go and how we're going to get there.
Great. Thanks so much, Vern. We're really happy to have you on board.
Great, thank you.
And last thing I have on my agenda, I have got the piece that we moved to your board agenda. I just want to acknowledge that Kevin Blaney is here, and this is Kevin's last SU board meeting. Kevin's been with me since the start of my time as superintendent, and he's seen us through Act 46. And he's also seen us through 3 years of pandemic response. And I know he was here when Jay was superintendent as well. He's been a long serving board member, both on his local board and at the SU level. And he's been a really solid, thoughtful board member. And I have appreciated his time and his effort as a board member, and he's definitely going to be missed. So I just wanted to say that to you, Kevin, while I had the chance.
Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank
Kevin.
you.
We will
Thank you.
miss
It's been
you
fun
for
working with you all.
sure.
Yeah, guys, I know we're down to only 4, but I need to leave here pretty quick. So we need to get things wrapped up here as quick as we can.
Okay, well, I think, Rick, that you could leave because Emily is back, right? Emily, you're here now? Oh, yeah, there she is. So if you need
So
to
far, so
duck
good.
out, we still have a quorum.
Okay, everybody have a good night.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay. Thanks, Rick. All right. So we're on to our central office updates. I'm just going to quickly go through here, but certainly want everyone, if there's something you'd like to share or highlight from your board report, that's always nice to hear. So Dominic, anything from you?
Nothing additional beyond what I had in there.
Okay. Any questions for Dominic from the board? Jody, anything that you'd like to add or highlight from your report?
I don't think she's on tonight.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Michelle, Taberge, anything from you?
I
You'd like
don't,
to highlight?
I don't have anything extra.
Okay. Michelle Irish?
I don't have anything extra either.
Okay. Michelle, I had a quick question. The link that you sent along with the survey, was I understanding that correctly, that that's going out to teachers?
Yeah, so it's actually what I sent you was those questions that will be in the survey, not an actual copy
Yeah.
of the survey.
Right.
But yes, we will be sharing those questions at the March in-service. Will be the faculty, instructional faculty will be engaging with those questions then.
And do you, will you be able to then report back and to the board your findings? Because it's really interesting. Those are interesting conversations to have. So I'm personally curious kind of how people are responding.
Sure. So there will be a bit of immediate feedback we'll be able to give because about 7 of the 10 questions are Likert scale. So we'll be able to do a quick snapshot of how those responses came out. And then 3 of the questions on the survey are open-ended. So that's going to take a little more analysis on my end to sort of code what the responses are and put them into some themes. And then the second part of that activity is actually, there will be some faculty discussions during the in-service on March 18th, where they'll be engaging in some sort of critical questions around these themes together as faculty. So they will also collect that information and be able to sort of put some themes together
Great.
from that data.
Great. Thanks. I appreciate it. That's wonderful.
And I think that the long-term goal is by the end of the school year to be able to turn that data into some action items moving forward to inform a multi-year plan.
Nice. Good stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Morgan, Heather is no longer with us in the meeting, eh?
That is correct.
Okay. Jamie, do you have anything further or anything you'd like to highlight from your report?
No, I have nothing further unless you have any questions.
Okay, thank you. Melissa, anything that you'd like to highlight or add?
Just a quick plug, we are putting together an event for Month of the Young Child in April, and we're looking at April 2nd. So we're working on getting that together, and you should be expecting details as we pull it together.
Nice, great, thank you. Robin, anything that you'd like to add to your report?
Robin isn't on, Mary.
She's not, okay. We already talked with Gabby and Vern did his introduction. So, all right, so we're now on to board business. And I'll try to make it brief. I know people are quite weary. I mean, Lynn, I'm happy to let everyone go at this point if you'd like.
I think that they should be here for the COVID guidance discussion.
Okay,
They can
sure.
let them go when it comes to negotiations.
Okay, all right, that sounds good. So, oh, right, the superintendent job description. So Polly and I have been working on that. So since she couldn't be here tonight, I think our plan is to bring kind of what we've done so far to the next meeting, which would be our April reorganization, that meeting, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we will bring that and present that to everyone at the April meeting. Oh, right below April 20th. Yes, I can tell I'm getting a little bleary-eyed at 8:40. Okay, so then any other agenda items? I mean, Lynn, I think you and I will need to kind of map out a little bit about the kind of the trajectory of our transportation kind of process now.
Yeah.
And then maybe at the April meeting, we can kind of share where we've landed with, you know, what that's gonna look like, what our timeline might be, what the ask of the board may be, so on and so forth.
Okay.
Do we not have a March meeting? Is that what you said?
Yeah, no March meeting.
Okay.
And that's that's kind of par for the course. We never have a March meeting. Or as long as I've been on the board, we haven't. So, okay, so then under our other, we have COVID considerations to discuss. So maybe Lynn, do you want to kind of like launch us in the conversation?
Sure. So this is a little complicated. So I'm going to just set the stage so that, and I apologize that it's 20 of 9, but this is an important part of our conversation tonight. So I just want to talk to you about our current reality, where we are. The AOE gave us guidance earlier in February that said that making masks optional would be connected to vaccination levels in schools. If you are at 80% or more of eligible students vaccinated, that they would be recommending, effective today, February 28th, a shift to masks as optional. So as of today, we do not have any data from the agency that indicates what our vaccination levels are. What they had told us is that they were merging the health information from the vaccination data and our October 1 enrollment information, and they would be assigning a value, a vaccination level value to our schools. So we do not have that. We also do not have the written guidance that was connected to that 80% vaccination rate. What's happened since then is that the governor and the secretary have indicated several times that it's a recommendation and boards can choose to follow it or to not follow it. They have also tipped that the 80% threshold is a threshold that is short term, and they're pretty quickly going to turn that around into a mask optional for all point in time. So we're used to guidance being complicated, and we're used to, you know, waiting on things and trying to make the best decision we can given what we have. There's an added layer of complexity to this one because the CDC made a change effective February 25th, so just a few days ago, that actually recommends that whether you're masking or not is connected to a community or county risk level. The other thing that they did was the bus, wearing masks on buses, that we didn't have an option about that. That was mandated at the federal level. So we looked at the data, worked with other superintendents in the county earlier today. We looked at Franklin County. We're considered yellow, which is medium risk. That puts us, in terms of CDC guidance, in a mask optional situation. So today, on top of this, today at around 3:45, I received guidance from the agency that said on February 25th, the CDC updated their COVID-19 guidance on wearing masks indoors, as well as on school buses. Vermont is currently evaluating the guidance. Schools should continue to follow the recommendations from the agency and the Department of Health to guide their decision-making. We will make an announcement later this week on next steps in our public health recommendations for schools. So earlier today, there's some Franklin County decisions that were made. So Franklin West released a letter indicating that they're going to move to mask optional by choice, effective on Wednesday. And while you were meeting tonight, the MVU board made a decision. They had a special meeting tonight to consider this, and they made a decision to follow the AOE guidance minus the 80% vaccination threshold. So they felt that the mask optional piece of the guidance was appropriate, but they did not believe that tying it to a vaccination rate made sense, knowing that we're quickly going to move into a period where it's not tied to a vaccination rate. So I've looked through, thought about all of those scenarios, like we usually do whenever it comes to making big decisions around the pandemic. And then today, when I got to the office, we pulled the language for the motion you made when you gave me pandemic decision-making authority. So on August 11, you made a decision to grant me the authority to make real-time decisions as they relate to COVID-19 as per the AOE and the VDH recommendations until December, at which time it sunsetted and you had to reevaluate. On December 15th, you made a motion to grant me the pandemic decision-making authority. In my mind, that was a reaffirmation of what you had decided in August. So you gave me the direction of following AOE and VDH. CDC was not mentioned in that. And there was no contemplation for what am I to do when there's conflicting guidance between the federal agency and our two state agencies that have been leading us this whole time. So nothing mentioned about CDC and nothing mentioned about the conflicting guidance. So I've thought a lot about this, and I feel like the board can do one of three things tonight. The first is you could tell me, I want you to continue to follow the AOE and the VDH guidance. So wait, see what comes out on Friday. You could tell me that you're going to grant me decision-making authority to also consider CDC guidance and then make the decision on my own. You also could make the decision to, as a board, say we're going to follow the CDC guidance. Or you can make a decision as a board, similar to what Ms. Siskoy just did, and say, follow the AOE guidance. We know that they're going to shift to not having it connected to the 80%. So let's just follow AOE minus the vaccination level, which would give you some stability in terms of not having to quantify what community, what is it called? The community, I just lost it. Community or county risk level. So there are those options there. I would recommend that if you do decide to make a decision as a board tonight, that you set some clear expectations around how we treat one another, in terms of there are going to be some people who have higher risk levels or beliefs that will make them want to choose to continue to wear masks. So just setting some really high standards for expecting, respectful interactions and allowing people to, make their own individual decisions without feeling any pressure from others to do something different. I think the other thing that if the board is to contemplate a change tonight, you would want to be really careful to indicate that, we've been here before. I was here in June. We were all here in June thinking, here's what lies ahead. And we were not able to imagine what lies ahead. So if you make this decision, I think it's going to be really important that we communicate that this is a decision that we're making right now, but if guidance shifts in the future or our circumstance around the pandemic shifts in the future, that it is possible that we would have to revert back to more restrictive mitigation measures in the future. So I need guidance and direction from the board, because on this one, I don't feel like I have the authority to go out there on my own.
Lynn, can you just clarify the board that just approved following the AOE guidance, but less the vaccination rate? Is that what they did? But are they following the CDC then of tying it to county risk rates of like the low, medium, high, or whatever it is?
So they, this all has evolved pretty quickly, Kat, because the CDC only happened 3 days ago. So I think it was Friday that all came out. So my original thought was they were going to shift to CDC guidance and just say, we're going to move in that direction. But what actually happened, and I think it makes some sense, is that they didn't want the volatility of having to go from green, yellow, red, and be, making that decision to mask on or mask off, unless that's where the AOE ends up recommending at the end of the week. So the AOE could choose at the end of the week to say, we think that you need to do something connected to the CDC guidance. But they could say, we're just going to go with mask optional for everyone. So we don't know what that is. So I think that gave them some cover to still say, we're following VDH and AOE, but we don't believe the 80% threshold is the right metric. The other thing that does, the 80% threshold, is it puts systems in this place where you have some schools who are going to meet your metrics and some schools who are not. So it's just a tricky place to be in. And this one feels, even more than some of the other decisions, it feels more like we've been thrust into the, yeah, but you can do whatever you want as a board on this one.
By landing where they did there, are they, I guess I don't 100% follow, are they mask optional at starting Wednesday or
Yes.
Friday? Yes.
So right now, Franklin West, which is your BFA Fairfax, and Missisquoi Valley will be mask optional beginning March 3rd, Wednesday.
Along with all buses, whether you choose to do anything moving forward, correct? Based on CDC guidance?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could still make masks mandated on buses, but that's not their intention. Their intention is to make it mask optional in all settings, still honoring that some people will need to choose for whatever reason to still want to wear the masks.
Okay.
Lynn, I must have misunderstood. I thought that we aren't able to make a decision on buses because that falls under a different set of regulations around masking, the federal transportation regulations.
Yeah, you were not allowed to, but they pulled that off on Friday, Mary. So they removed the federal mandate around buses. So if we were in a different place in the pandemic and you weren't already contemplating masking by choice, you could say, well, even though the federal mandate has gone away, we could continue on with it. So I just think that the complexity of this is the intersect with the CDC, because we have hung our hat on following VDH and AOE from the start of the pandemic, and the CDC there was a period of time where the CDC was modeling after some of the things that were happening in Vermont early on, because we were doing a pretty good job of keeping the virus at bay. And then we've seen this year more shifts with CDC coming out ahead of some of the things. And that's the situation that we're in right now.
Well, I mean, I do feel as though the trend regionally across the state and obviously across the country is toward mask optional, given where the numbers are currently. I mean, and I'm in support of that. I have some concerns about the under 5 set for whom vaccination is not yet an option, and whether, you know, they're going to now be a little more at risk in buildings around a lot more unmasked but vaccinated kids, as most of them are, the older kids. But that's where one-way masking does offer some degree of protection. I mean, I can personally attest to that because I work at a restaurant where I'm the only person. As a high-risk individual myself, I'm really sensitive around kind of being in that smaller percentage of people who are more vulnerable. And you know, one-way masking is keeping me pretty safe so far. So I'm comfortable with moving toward mask optional. I know it's been so kind of divisive and contentious, and I don't necessarily think that the current epidemiological numbers in our community would support kind of an ongoing mask mandate right now. But I do think it's really important that that caveat exists, that these things can change really quickly, as we've seen when Delta rose up and as we've seen with that last wave of Omicron. And so I think that it just is important for the community, I think, to know that we'll have to continue to be nimble around our responsiveness, because we may not be 100% out of the, you know, done with mitigation measures that are driven by the public health situation in the moment.
And
And
like
then
you said,
oh, sorry. And then just the only other thing that I'm so sensitive to is, because it's been so contentious, I really want how we language this to, like, just remind people to be kind and to kind of support individual kind of choice around this, and especially to recognize that we do legitimately have vulnerable members health-wise in our communities. And if they are continuing to mask, they're very likely masking for good reasons. So that's my 2 cents. But I do think that we should want to move forward around this for now, and we'll revisit it as needed.
I
and
think
that's
that,
all.
go ahead, Kat, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
no, sorry, it's quick. That's all I was going to emphasize too, is just, you know, the language, and, you know, so that we don't all of a sudden create another or more stigma around those who want to mask. And I was reading something about, even after the CDC stuff came out, doctors, you know, who would say, like, we still encourage it to anybody who sees that as the right choice for themselves, you know, and that's really what it needs to be about. Optional doesn't mean if you're uncomfortable, you throw it away, like, still wear it, you know. So really getting that message out, I think, is important.
So not knowing exactly where this conversation was going to go tonight, I drafted a couple of different communications, because this is an open public meeting. I know how social media works, and I was really hoping to be the one that got to tell our community whatever the decision is going to be. So I've got a couple of communications drafted. The one that makes the most sense, given how I'm hearing your conversation going, addresses some of the things that you're talking about. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read you 5 bullets that are in the communication. The first is 4 bullets. Students, families, and staff will make the decision for themselves when it comes to masking. People will need to choose to respect other people's decisions and be kind to others making a choice that differs from their own. Some people will choose to continue to wear a mask some of the time or all of the time based on their beliefs, personal health conditions, etc. No one should be ridiculed, pressured, or made fun of for choosing to wear or not wear a mask. There are some added complexities because we're not moving together as a state. They've kind of left this into the local realm based on some of the things they've stated. So just wanted to be really clear. We have one more week of high school athletics that are going to be within schools, and then it kind of moves on to Berry Auditorium and UVM. So masking requirements at all athletic events will be based on whatever guidelines are established by the home team. So we need to understand that as visitors, we will follow the home gym expectations without exception. So if we make a decision to make masks optional in FNESU, if we go down the road to Milton in the playoffs, we're not giving Milton a hard time and saying we're not wearing masks. We're going to do whatever their expectation is in their gym. I mean, that actually came out of a VPA guidance document that came earlier. The other added complexity is around career and tech centers because we share students. So we receive some students from other schools and some of our students go out to other tech centers based on offerings. So students attending career and tech ed centers outside of FNESU will need to follow the masking expectations established by the CTE center. And the last bullet is, as a community, we need to understand that the future is unpredictable. At some point, we may need to revisit our existing mitigation measures in response to future changes to guidance and current conditions related to the pandemic. So if I were to communicate and include those bullets, does that include what your concerns just were that you were identifying?
Yes.
I think it covers them well.
So Lynn, do you want a formal motion from the board? Or just our kind of blessing to proceed?
I just think you need to tell me to move or to not move, because I don't think I can make this decision on my own.
Okay.
I think the board should make the motion, Mary.
Okay.
I think we should just take it off from Lynn and we'll carry this one.
Okay.
So, I mean, with that, I'll make the motion to be mask optional, however you worded it before, Lynn, with the I like the MVU language, tying it to the VDH and AOE guidance.
So follow that minus the 80% threshold.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So that's the motion on the table. By roll, Emily,
Aye.
Kevin,
Aye.
Kat.
Aye.
And Mary is an aye. And I would say, kind of piggybacking on that, I do think, I mean, barring some unforeseen virulent variant, I think that we can transition back to in-person meetings as of April. So maybe we could just quickly discuss that, how people are, whether people are comfortable making that move back to in person.
Can I stop you for one quick second? We didn't put a start date on that. And I don't.
Oh, sorry. I was just kind of assuming as of Wednesday, day after tomorrow, when we go back to school. Unless, Lynn, do you feel like we should wait until you get that final new guidance on Friday? Or really, it's kind of, we're doing it, we might as well just do it.
I don't actually see a ton of benefit in saying, let's sit in this for another few days. I think that it's a really confusing time for our community. You're hearing the federal government say one thing, and you're hearing the AOE and you're hearing VDH say something else, but the AOE and VDH have already indicated that their guidance is short term, and they've already said you don't have to follow it exactly. So I'm just feeling like we know we're heading there. I don't know that we need to put our teachers and students through a few more days of navigating that conflict between federal and state. I don't think you get enough benefit from it. So my recommendation is Wednesday.
Yeah.
That
makes sense.
I just want to put this out there. I know, like, this is just happening now, but at what point, and will there be consideration given given to, like, when will people be let back into our buildings? Like, as far as, attendance to taekwondo or, a school concert or conferences.
We actually met I met with the leaders, I think on the Wednesday or Thursday before the break. And that's one of the conversations that we had is we're really shifting out of the pandemic response to this, where the pandemic response, the goal was to, block the building to try to keep the virus out of the building. So that prevented lots of people from coming in. We still, and Dan talked about this at a previous press conference, we still have schools that had extreme mitigation measures in place where, kids were isolated. And I think he used an example of kids had to face the wall when their masks were off and they were eating their lunch in some schools in other parts of the state. So I think that the tricky place where we're at right now is this has been our lived experience for 3 school years. And the last 2 have been kind of doozies in terms of all that we've had to follow in terms of expectations. So we need to peel those back, and that's going to take a little bit for staff to, and I'm not saying just staff, but to let go of. So we actually talked about that at the leadership team meeting, that it's time to let go of some of those mitigation measures. We're in a place where, COVID is not going to go anywhere, and we need to shift out of this pandemic response to the virus and into an endemic response of us getting used to living with it. We still are going to do things like say you can't come in if you're sick, and we'll put those kinds of measures in place. We'll still make masks available for those who want them. We'll still make sure that testing is widely available. But I think it's time that we re-engage our communities and re-engage families. It became glaringly obvious to me when I was on a committee recently with a parent who was a junior in high school. And I realized that from her perspective, she had a few months when her child was a freshman where she got to engage and go into the building. And now the child is ending this year, their junior year, going into senior year next year, and they haven't been back in the building. And that's so sad when you really look at that, or even look at a now second grader. Their parents haven't been allowed in since kindergarten. So we're shifting that way. It'll take a little bit for our procedures to catch up with that, Kat. So the schools will be communicating about how they're rolling those things back, but they're coming.
Okay, and will there also, I was just thinking as you were saying that, another piece in your communication that maybe also just touches on, the other mitigation factors, like still keep your kid home when they're sick and still wash your hands and, all these things that we have really stepped up through this time, like we should still be doing. And yeah,
It's been there. We will still follow other expectations from BDH and AOE around hand hygiene, staying home when you're sick, making high quality masks available to students and staff who want to wear them, and providing testing resources to those that want it, et cetera.
Great. Well, good. I mean, this is hopeful. It's good. It is time. So I'm glad that we landed in that place. So Lynn, I know we need to talk about negotiations. So maybe we can let everyone go on and get to bed, and the board can just stay for a few more minutes to discuss the negotiation. Do we need an executive session, or it's just an update, Lynn?
It's an executive session, but I can make it brief.
No problem.
Direction.
Okay, so I'm going to make the motion to enter executive session at 9:07 to discuss negotiations, and by roll, Kevin,
Aye.
Emily,
Aye.
Kat,
Mary
is an aye, and good night, and thank you to everyone else who sat through a 3-hour-long meeting. Appreciate it. Take care, folks.
And you are out of executive session.
All right, thanks, Morgan. So we are out of executive session with no motions pending. And I think unless there's anything else, all we need is a motion to adjourn.
Can I make it the last one?
Absolutely, Kevin. We'll miss you.
Thank you.
Don't be a stranger.
Try not to be.
All righty. So motion to adjourn, maybe give me a thumbs up if everyone's all good.
Have a good night.
You
Take
too.
care all.
Thanks.
Have a good
Hey,
night.
Kevin.